Hey everyone, thanks for joining us here. I'm just going to give it another couple of minutes while a couple more participants file in, and then we'll get started. Hey everyone, I think we have most of our attendees signed in, so I'm going to get started. I'd like to start by welcoming you all to ASLA New York's now virtual for CEUs in the Beer event on site design strategies for health and wellness. This event was originally scheduled to take place in person in March, and we are very excited to be able to share this with you virtually now. I want to thank our speakers for being here and our audience for joining us today. This event is registered with LACES by the New York chapter of ASLA. Because this is a virtual event, go to the next slide. Anyone looking for CEUs will need to stay for the entire duration of the event and complete a quiz at the end. In order to get credits, you'll need to score 80% or higher on the quiz and fill out the course evaluation. Before we get started, I'd also like to give special thanks to our sponsors, Inova and Deeproot. Inova is celebrating 50 years in the industry. You can visit inovafurnishings.com to learn more about their products. Inova also sponsors an annual LARE grant competition, which offers $1,000 grants to 20 winners. If you're a licensed landscape architect who knows someone working towards becoming licensed, you can submit a nomination by November 13th. Deeproot Green Infrastructure, if you do not know them, develops solutions to enhance urban forests and surrounding watersheds in city streets, parking lots, campuses, and other heavily paved areas. They have more than 40 years of experience helping trees thrive in cities, nurturing over 500 blocks of urban treescape in the built environment around the world. Al's contact information is on the screen if you'd like to know more from him. And I am now going to turn this over to our moderator, Jennifer Nitsky.
Control L. Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Nitsky. I am a landscape architect and a certified arborist. I'm also the trustee for the American Society of Landscape Architects New York chapter. And I work for a firm called Studio HIP Landscape Architecture, PLLC. I've been designing outdoor spaces, primarily parks, playgrounds, and plazas for over 20 years. And currently focusing a lot on children's outdoor environments. Okay, this is not forwarding. There we go. So I'm going to start out today's panel discussion and presentations with brief introduction to biophilia and our connection to the natural world for wellness. For those who don't know what biophilia is, it is our innate desire to connect with nature. It's why we are drawn to nature and why we want to be connected to nature. It is the reason why we are more at peace when we go for a walk in the woods or sit on a park bench. Also, it's becoming much more important that we maintain these connections, especially during times like a global pandemic when we're spending so much time indoors and like today in front of a computer. A few years back, I read this really great book called The Nature Fix, written by Florence Williams, who is a science writer. She told the story of how she was living in suburban America for so many years. And when she moved to a very urban area, she started noticing how much more stressed she was, how irritable she was, how often she was getting sick. And it wasn't until she was on assignment in Korea and in Singapore where she started learning about the benefits of being in nature. And she actually went through a whole series of interesting activities where she spent days on end in nature and forests. And she, in this book, she talks about all of the different benefits that she noticed herself firsthand after immersing herself with nature. She learned that in 15 minutes in nature, you can actually reduce your stress. Going for a simple walk through a local park or botanical garden was all it took. 20 minutes can improve happiness. Researchers from the University of Alabama at Birmingham have found that the magic number is 20 minutes. Spending time in any urban green space can improve happiness and well-being regardless of whether or not that time was spent exercising. Spend even more time, sorry, I don't know why the slide's not showing up. 45 minutes can improve your cognitive abilities. And even more so, if you are not able to get outside, looking out a window at nature, at trees, at greenery can lower your anxiety, improve your concentration, and also boost your creativity. Also, if you have plants on your windowsill, that helps too. So you can also bring nature indoors. Have houseplants, grow your own vegetables and herbs. During the early stages of the current pandemic, when so many people were spending a lot more time indoors and some even afraid to be outdoors, there was a growing trend to purchase indoor plants and start growing your own vegetables and herbs. The owner of the Urban Garden Center in Harlem had reported to have had their best year ever in their 57-year history on sales of houseplants and products to grow your own vegetables. They were fortunate and lucky to have been deemed an essential business in March and were able to stay open all throughout the pandemic here in New York City. They're also an outdoor establishment, which helps. So something else that we can do is embed nature in everyday activities like reading, checking your email on your cell phone, or even just relaxing. Today, children spend an average of 4 to 7 minutes a day outdoors in unobstructed play and 7 hours a day in front of a screen. This is approximately 75% less time outdoors than in previous generations. And now with remote learning and physical distance requirements, lack of outdoor time is likely to have detrimental effects on children's well-being. With many school buildings opening back up this fall, choices were either to go to school indoors, where experts say they can be at higher risk of virus transmissions, or they can continue learning, distance learning remotely, which experts also agree compromises educational outcomes and accelerates inequality. In May of 2020, Green Schoolyards America began an initiative to pair landscape architects and designers with schools across the country to help develop concept plans that enable schools to provide outdoor classrooms and spaces that meet physical distance requirements. As of October this month, over 250 designers volunteered from 31 states and 6 countries to develop tools that schools can use to bring learning outdoors. You can learn more at greenschoolyards.org, and we'll put that link in the chat box brief in just a few minutes. Another great program that is nationwide is was initiated here in New York City. The New York City outdoor classrooms, the New York City Playgrounds program by the Trust for Public Land they have built over 250 schoolyards from asphalt to vibrant green and green infrastructure schoolyards. In New York City, there are over 50 that have outdoor classrooms, and they have been utilized through this program. So being outdoors reduces transmission rates and offers additional space to have physical distancing. Even if it's just one class period when the weather is good, children will benefit from being in the fresh air. And if there's access to the natural environment, they'll also have greater concentration, which helps them to learn better. Which is why it would be great if all of our schools all across the country had outdoor space where children can learn. Now more than ever, we need to provide quality public green space for all neighborhoods, streets, and schools to ensure quick accessibility to the benefits of nature, especially in those communities that lack green space. And we can be creative in how we provide these spaces, from installing outdoor people spaces in parking lanes with raised planter borders to removing asphalt schoolyards to create vibrant green infrastructure. Today, I'm excited to present to you 4 experts who will dive deeper into all aspects of health, wellness, and design. I have some resources here, and I will put those in the chat box for your quick access, and we can provide those after this presentation. Now I'm very pleased to introduce to you Sadiya Muqueeth, who is going to talk about the benefits of being in nature.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Jennifer, and for the entire team in having me here today. I'll be sharing my screen. I want to confirm that you can see the screen and not the presenter mode, hopefully. Could someone confirm that in the chat function? How about now? All right, great. Let's get started. Thank you so much again for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I know that we had aimed to do this in person, but circumstances obviously put a little barrier around that. So I'll be talking a little bit about community health and parks really as an essential feature of that infrastructure. I work for the Trust for Public Land. Our aim is to create parks and protect land for people because we believe that everyone needs and deserves parks and public space. We've created over 5,000 parks and trails and schoolyards, protected, generated over $80 billion in public funding, and created access to over 3 million acres of land for people. And in terms of why we do our work, it's really focused on a couple of key outcomes, which are around health, around equity, and climate, really placing community at the center of the work. I'll start off before I begin, just like with a little story. This is a schoolyard that I had visited when I first joined the organization in December of 2019 from Philadelphia. It was located in a high poverty area, had some water challenges that the city was addressing, and had some significant stressors in terms of effects on the family, as well as limited play space and its sort of experiences in that schoolyard. It also experiences a high rate of suspension. So I wanted to just flag that, keep this story in mind as we sort of progress through. In terms of the language I'll be using parks to reference a number of different things, interaction with nature, remote forests, green space broadly. So it is all captured under this larger umbrella of parks. But as we think about health, I think now we often think about our COVID crisis, or before this COVID pandemic, we often thought about a doctor or a hospital or the nurse. But health is far more than that. It is this complete state of physical, mental, social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And that what we often thought about as health was actually healthcare, and that's the range of services that are offered. But there's another caveat, and there's another part of health, which is community health. And community health is really thinking about the context in which people live in. So it's a multi-sector, multidisciplinary, collaborative approach using evidence-based strategies that works with communities, and I want to emphasize that, working with communities to really respond to the health needs there, as well as the quality of life. And in the context and the history of American health and healthcare, we've all often focused on these sort of downstream factors. What you see is providing clinical care. And we've started in recent years, at least in the healthcare system, to start thinking about more and more those social needs, those midstream needs. But in order to really have an effect, a long-lasting effect on the things that keep us out of the doctor's office, we need to start focusing even more on the upstream effects. And that's really getting to the conversation around parks and the community conditions that we live in that inform those outcomes. So whether they be laws, policies, or the actual city design. Tom Frieden, former CDC director, categorized this in a slightly different way, where he looked at public health interventions ranging from the top, very individualized care, coaching, for example, around healthy eating or exercise. But towards the bottom, what we see is changing the context in which people live, learn, work, and play, as well as those socioeconomic factors that are driving those outcomes. And these are really where we see that interaction of parks, green space, and nature, that we can change that bottom piece of that pyramid, of this health impact pyramid, so that we can have a larger impact on the health and well-being of communities. And these are termed the social determinants of health, or the conditions in which we live, learn, work, and play that affect a wide range of health risks and health outcomes. And within the built environment, that of course includes this green space and parks. There are other ones, economic stability, education, and as Jennifer mentioned, these pieces interact with each other as in terms of the education component that she mentioned. Social context, including anti-bias or racism, and food insecurity, health, and healthcare. And in relationship to parks and green space, what we've seen is that time spent in and around nature, as demonstrated here in Professor Kuo's paper, that there are multiple pathways that this may affect our health and health outcomes, whether it's residential greening levels affecting birth weight, or rates of depression and rates of anxiety. Other research has also outlined this work, looking at mood, blood pressure, really capturing the range of different research that's been conducted in this area for decades now. And at Trust for Public Land, we think about this work in sort of 4 domains. First and foremost is physical health. We know that epidemiologic research has found inverse relationships between park investment, so dollar amounts, and all-cause mortality. Analysis of 30 years of data for all available US counties found that $100 increase in per capita investment in parks and recreation was associated with a decrease in 3.4 deaths per 100,000, suggesting that increased funding for parks could be considered a broader public health intervention. We've also found that other studies have found greenness levels measured by normalized difference vegetation index have inverse relationships with stroke and heart disease outcomes. And these are some of the leading causes of death in the US. But beyond sort of just the outcomes, we also know that proximity to parks affects our behaviors, so our physical activity, which is linked to diabetes, hypertension, obesity, et cetera. And we know that living closer to a park means that you're more likely to be physically active. We also know that only 1 in 2 Americans gets the recommended amount of physical activity. And if you factor in strength training, it goes down to about 1 in 4. So in the way that we think about this and the way that we think about what's available, we need to think about access, yes. But there are facets that are challenge this, specifically safety. So those benefits are less likely to occur, people are less likely to enjoy those spaces if they don't sense that it is a space safe to engage with. Next is mental health and social well-being as well. And so in terms of this, we know that being more physically active in and of itself is associated with improved mental health outcomes. It's a protective effect, for example, when it comes to reducing sort of cognitive decline as we age. But that living nearby nature improves not only, improves stress or sort of reduces stress and improves school performance, but it also affects ADD symptoms. And that physician-diagnosed depression was 33% higher in residential areas with the fewest green spaces compared to those with the most. We also know that this affects some of the most vulnerable members of our community. Studies, again, done by Professor Kuo, found that public housing residents assigned to live in housing blocks without nearby nature compared to those assigned to live with in blocks with nearby nature experience higher experiences around attention fatigue. And we know that finally, that this can actually all be turned into a dollar amount. Professor Buckley out of Australia and a team of researchers assessed the link between park visitation and mental health care dollars. And this was specific to, I believe, national parks. And they've actually turned this into mental health care costs, a measure of mental health care costs, and a conservative estimate of $6 trillion globally. But that range went from $5 trillion to $31 trillion potentially globally in terms of the effects of benefits that we see when it comes to mental health. The key among that is that we need to consider psychological benefits are really positively associated with the diversity of plant life, so that design factors really is important in that. And people who spent time in a park where they had more of a richness of plant species, et cetera, scored higher on different measures of well-being than those that were less diverse. And finally, we look at this component of sort of the environmental benefits, which is often where we used to start, whether it's water quality or air quality. September 2020 was the hottest September in record. And we know that individuals who experience these heat-related illnesses, it's the highest all-cause mortality factor when it comes to weather-related mortality. So looking specifically at facets of heat. And then finally, we know that exposure to particulate matter and ozone was associated with increased risk of preterm birth, and that among 19 out of 24 studies, as well as low birth weight in 25 out of 29 studies. Sorry about the cat in the background. But in the health of the U.S., we often think about these factors in terms of disparities and disparities by demographic factors. And we know that in this context, we look at race as one of those key demographic factors. But in the U.S., race is only a social construct, because as a South Asian Muslim woman, I am maybe considered, Indian here, but in let's say South America, where I served in Peace Corps, they considered me Brazilian. So as we look at this in the context of race in the U.S., it's really a proxy measure for racism and the differential experiences around institutionalized or structural racism. And these are different definitions that Professor Kamara Jones provides around those facets of health in the U.S. And finally, I think one facet of that is really redlining. Obviously, it's not only specifically associated in terms of redlining, but that there are historic wrongs that are contributing to today's health inequities. So Professor Hoffman conducted research that found that 94% of studies that they looked at, the redline neighborhoods had 5% warmer readings than compared to non-redline neighborhoods, and that there were the differences were almost 13 degrees higher in some areas. And we did our own analysis here over the summer, looking at park disparities in non-white neighborhoods, and found that non-white neighborhoods are half as, parks in majority non-white neighborhoods are half as large and serve nearly 5 times as many people than majority white neighborhoods. And in low-income communities, we found that they are a 4th as large and serve nearly 4 times as many people than in majority high-income neighborhoods. And so that really leads us to this conversation around equity and justice. If we approach park and nature access from the perspective of equality, where everyone is sort of provided the same item, we're not really going to be able to provide what's needed for the community locally. And so this is really one small representation, but I think a really poignant one around what we need to be responsive to local community needs. Which takes me back to this story, returning to Philadelphia, Patterson Elementary School. It left a particularly important mark because this is the after effect of a green schoolyard. Jennifer had mentioned the positive effects there, that they had originally started to work on green schoolyards in Philadelphia with a concept to capture stormwater in order to work with, in order to address sort of environmental benefits. But found that the green schoolyard was actually reduced suspension rates before and after. So this is anecdotal, but that it went from 32 suspensions to close to 0 in the following year, and that students were able to use the space, which means that there's a significant benefit to parents that don't have the stress of finding sort of childcare, if this child is suspended, and don't have the stress of navigating those potential other outcomes that may come out of a suspension, such as missed school. But in addition to that, they found that it had a social benefit. Over time, it took longer and longer to do dismissal, whereas before, as you can see here, parents would pick up their children and sort of leave. They found that people were staying by. They were more engaged in what was happening in the school, and they were engaging with other parents and really building community, which nature has such a fantastic capacity to do. So this is why I believe that we really need to move towards this commitment to ensure that underinvested communities and communities with structural barriers around access to high quality public spaces have a fair and just opportunity to derive the many health benefits of nature and public parks. And I'm going to underline that concept of fair and just opportunity here, because that is the definition of health equity. And we've seen that time and time again in the context of the pandemic. This picture is actually of how one park system was managing in Connecticut their trails and their increased influx of individuals. We know this pre-pandemic context had high rates of loneliness and social isolation, especially among older adults. We knew that there's a sedentary lifestyle, and we knew that there were increasing focus on mental health needs, especially coming out of the 2014 opioid crisis. And finally, we have a long history of inequity and disparity and power differential in the US that affects every aspect of our life, including health. And the context of all of this public health challenge was that the pandemic really amplified that. Pandemics we've moved into crisis response, and everything in that context, as we saw time and time again, was heightened. And so how can we move away from that is protecting our cities and our communities through more resilient design, and that includes access to nature. One of the reports that we put out actually found that people in that context were visiting their parks and green space, and more people were sort of discovering this aspect of their community in a way that they hadn't before. In Dallas, one of the popular trails, their visitation rose from 30% to 75% in the month of March alone. And so there's a significant impact in how we think about the management and investment in the social and infrastructure services that communities need. And so in order to build resilience, we need to ensure that we are prioritizing equity, that we are prioritizing justice, and that spaces are looking at, yes, access within a 10-minute walk, but also looking at quality and inclusiveness of the locations themselves. Finally, investment always matters, and that everyday places and spaces are critical to that engagement. And in terms of process, we want to ensure that we are engaging multiple people to look at multiple benefits of the land, so that there isn't sort of an independent approach of just sort of looking at traditional planning, looking at it and then assuming that that will sort of continue on, but really taking more of a fail-fast approach, engaging people in a diverse conversation around the use of the space and moving that forward and evaluating the impact of that. So what does that mean in terms of the path forward? I propose that it means driving evidence-based action. Again, there have been sort of 40 years, if not more, of research around the benefits of nature and health, on health, but that really needs to come together in terms of action. That we need to elevate and boost community representation and partnership in that process, and that we need to change mindsets, that this is essential infrastructure and this is a space and place that needs to be attended to in order to see community health outcomes before someone even engages with their doctor or nurse. Such that this will all lead to increased access to high quality parks, increased usage of parks, and increased support and stewardship for parks and green space, so that we can all have healthy, livable communities for generations to come. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sadiya. We now have Nélida Quintero from the Center for Urban Design and Mental Health.
Hello, I'm going to also start the sharing screen process here. Okay, there we go. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here today to present on well-being in the city and exploring connections between urban design and mental health. I'm Nélida Quintero. I'm an architect and environmental psychologist. And yes, I'm a fellow at the Center for Urban Design and Mental Health. And I also serve the American Psychological Association NGO team at the United Nations. As well as I also teach at FIT. Now, I'm going to focus my conversation, my presentation on this topic on the contemporary experience of place. Because the experience of place has changed over time, and it has become more urban, indoor, and mediated. And I'll explain in a little bit what I mean by mediated. But this creates in itself certain conditions that that we can probably address through design, and we definitely have to be more conscious of as designers and researchers. So yes, our contemporary experience of place is more urban. Meaning more of us live in the city. And it's interesting that a lot of our conversations are very focused on international migration, so crossing national borders. But when we actually look at the greater migration, is really going from rural environments to more urban environments. And we know, for example, that in 1950, 30% of the world's population was urban. And when we look at the projections from the United Nations, the expectation is that by 2050, 68%, almost 70% of the population, global population, will be urban. And we also live more indoor oriented lives. And this is something that has changed from way in the past to now. There's a research that is often quoted or often used, even though it's from the 90s, so I'm mentioning it here. Already at that time, when there was an assessment done, it was an EPA-sponsored human activity pattern survey. At that point, already 86.9% of the American population was spending time, the majority of the American population was spending 86.9% of their time indoors. And that has been corroborated by more recent studies from, you might know, the Velux Corporation. They did some surveys, a multinational study in which they found out that yes, about 90% of our time is spent indoors. Even though most of the participants believe that they only spend 66% of their time indoors. And that means, that includes not only the time we might spend at home and work and third places like restaurants and stores, but also transportation, so inside transportation. Next, mediated. All that time that we spend in the city indoors, we also seem to spend a large portion of our day in interacting or with media, right? Whether it's for entertainment or social life, for work. We are interacting through whether it's a phone, laptop with a screen. So we spend about, it's estimated from surveys, this is Nielsen data, that it's about 11 hours per day that we are listening to, watching, reading, or interacting with media. So these particular conditions that are characteristic of our lives today bring with them some particular challenges. In terms of the urban environment, for instance, we know that density is a big issue, and you probably heard a lot about nowadays discussing, the benefits and disadvantages of density, the problems that we are facing in the cities in terms of we both have the stressor of isolation and the stressor of overcrowding. In terms of pollution that has been linked to a sense of well-being, we know that fresh air, or polluted air, and noise pollution are problems in that respect as stressors. Also, in terms of the fact that we live indoors primarily, we have a decreased exposure to natural elements that, we've had some great discussion on that earlier on, including the fact that we have less exposure to sunlight, daylight, and to natural ventilation. And again, these are stressors that affect our well-being. And in terms of the fact that we spend so much time interacting with media, there's a lot of research, and that's again growing exponentially as we spend more and more time interacting through media. There's a question that I personally researched as far as how we perceive privacy versus sociability, or what is private space, what is public space, what is private and public space in the physical environment, what is private and public space in the virtual world, for instance. We also have research looking at the fact that many of us are suffering from information overload, that we are feeling stressed by the amount of information that we have access to and that is coming to us. And that has some effects also on our ability to focus and maintain our attention, on whatever it is that we'd rather have our attention directed to. So what can we do in terms of proposing solutions, in particular in relationship to the built environment, to promote and sustain well-being in this contemporary experiences place that is urban, indoor, and mediated? So I'm going to connect some of these solutions to the idea of connections to people and community, connections to nature, and connections to place. In terms of connections to people and community, we know there's research, some of it was mentioned earlier on, that spaces that encourage social interaction and togetherness can have impacts that relate to well-being. For instance, we know that they increase social capital. That makes sense because we can make social connections with strangers, create social networks, and then benefit from the social, from the resources that we can have from all of these networks that we build. There's also research that has shown, for example, we tend to collaborate more with one another. And there's one particular study that's very interesting. They actually did it within a workplace environment, and they mapped all the places where people could come across one another in casual ways and maybe spend time with people that they normally don't spend time with. So we would be looking at circulation spaces and shared spaces, the kitchenettes. And they found that those people that had more opportunities to come across others in the circulation spaces and shared spaces, that they tended to collaborate on projects more than others who didn't. And they even found that they applied for grants together. This is in a scientist environment, and these were scientists that were within this kind of lab office environment, and they found that they were more likely to engage in projects together and to actually apply for grants together. Clearly, also this connection, the fact that we can create more social capital, increases the sense of being part of a community. So it promotes social cohesion, and that social cohesion can lead to increased social and civic engagement. So here's an example of a successful public space in Trafalgar Square in London, for instance. So very, very active prior to the pandemic. So what this is going to mean in terms of all these benefits that we get from those very kind of healthfully dense spaces are now, we don't have that opportunity at the moment. And this is something that is happening now, and that we'll know the consequences of it later on. But there's ways of trying to think of what we can do about it. I think we still have to maintain that 6 foot distance. And these are the situations we're encountering where some of those spaces, we don't have the kind of access that we were able to have prior to the pandemic. Similarly, we know that there's the third places, you probably heard about this, They're also have a great benefit, again, for connecting with strangers, and privately owned public spaces or third places serve that need as well. Similarly to public spaces, here's one space that I've used quite a bit, the Representative Truman Lincoln Center, where actually you do have a coffee opportunity to have a coffee there, but you are not really you don't really have to do it. You can just go in and sit and, with a laptop or a book and just spend time with surrounded by other people, and still have that sense, of a communal space that you can share. But again, with the pandemic, this benefit of social opportunity and social interaction is limited, or it's again, it's different. There are many proposals from various designers. How do we work around this? Can we just bring back the benefits of that type of social interaction in third place, and yet remain, physically distanced? Here I'm showing an interesting proposal from a designer in Amsterdam, where they have these glass enclosures. They're very well designed so that they're actually ventilated, but they maintain a sense of shelter. And but at the same time, it's a shared space because there are other people there as well. But you can have that sense of protection from potential contagion. And the idea here is trying to maintain that feeling that you are interacting in a third place. Similarly, we have the condition in the workplace, where those opportunities of feeling connected and running into one another and making new connections with people you normally don't interact with. This is again challenge in the workplace. We now have, given our current condition, we have to keep distance, and we're reminded of that distance through markings. It's the right thing to do for physical well-being. What the consequences will be for our mental well-being, psychosocial well-being, is something that we are finding about as we're living it today. Now, additionally, there's the connection to nature that has been discussed earlier today. But that has a great many benefits. The research on this has exponentially grown in the last few decades, because we're finding that there's so many benefits to being exposed to nature. We know from research, of course, that there's that exposure to nature can lower stress levels, can lower blood pressure, can have an impact in reducing depression and anxiety, can increase our mood and positive affect, can make us feel somewhat in a better mood, feel happier, diminish low moods. It can also increase or encourage physical activity, right? As was mentioned before, if you are if you have the opportunity to being in a nature environment, you might feel more encouraged to take walks. If you're in a park with exercise equipment, you might feel more encouraged to actually engage with that. Additionally, we know from very seminal research, which some of you might know about already, there's a study by Ulrich that found that if you, after surgery, if you were recuperating, if you recuperated in a room that has a window with a view of nature, as opposed to recuperating after surgery in a room that has window with a view of a brick wall, that the people who were exposed to nature during that time were more likely to heal faster, and actually they were released sooner from the hospital. So clearly there seems to be a benefit for healing. And at the end, there's research on attention restoration by Kaplan and others, showing that the impact of information overload, for instance, that makes us sometimes lose our ability to maintain our attention or focus on tasks at hand, that with a percentage, with a small time in nature, that we regained that ability to focus again. And these kinds of spaces are often called restorative spaces, and they've been researched, and they seem to serve a great benefit in sort of regenerating or restoring our attentional abilities. Now, can we provide those kinds of spaces in the urban environment? Yes, there's many examples. I like this one in particular, the Paley Park in New York City. And as you can see, it's more, it's a public space, but it's more geared towards kind of reflection and connection to space. There's this very nice water feature, and that kind of sense of kind of a space for reflection and restoration. Now, some countries, knowing this research on the benefits of urban green space, have made an effort, and I think we all cities should make an effort to make sure that even as we grow and the urban population grows, that we save spaces within the city to serve as green spaces that bring all this well-being benefits to people who live in the city. Singapore, that is one of the most dense countries, has made a long-term commitment to maintain and preserve spaces throughout the country and throughout the cities to provide some kind of green space that is not too far away from anybody, so that they're well distributed throughout. And here you see one project is the Gardens by the Bay in Singapore. Now, what's happened also is that we've built up a lot and in the city, right? And sometimes we may not have access, even if we decide we would like to have exposure to nature or some view of it, that the opportunity of actually doing that may not be as easy when you're in the city, right? Because there's other buildings around you. So there is this increased interest, and I think it's a really sort of creative approach towards bringing the benefit of nature to other spaces, just bringing elements that can be used as natural elements indoors. And this was sent to me by a colleague. I thought it was particularly interesting. This lobby wanted to have some kind of nature element, and they just brought it indoors by creating this big green wall and then they populated the green wall with edible greens. So they actually can harvest the wall and use it in the restaurant, right? So that's has a double or triple, quadruple benefit, right? All the benefits from nature are brought indoors, of exposure to nature brought indoors, plus you have a living wall that you can then use to consume food in the restaurant. Now, additionally, one aspect that to me has been very, very interesting is the benefit of daylight and sunlight. And we're finding now more and more every day, I mean, what happens to the human body and the human mind when we have exposure to sunlight. I'm particularly interested, for instance, I've been looking at the impact of that on vision, and maybe the last few decades, it's been found that that exposure to sunlight has an impact actually in the growth of the eye. So that you're more likely, apparently from this new research, you're more likely to become nearsighted if you don't have a certain percentage amount of exposure to the type of light that you're usually exposed to when you're outdoors, right? And it's not clear, the research is being done, but is it, what a specific quality of the sunlight is having this impact. But additionally, we know, for instance, that sunlight and daylight affects mood, and most of us know about seasonal affective disorder and the fact that when we have lamps that mimic that exposure, we can have sort of a reversal of a low mood, right? So it increases our mood, makes it brings it up. We also, many of you, I'm sure, have thought about circadian rhythms and the impact that we know exposure to sunlight can have on that. You know, you will sleep better. You'll be more alert during the daytime if you have the right amount of sunlight exposure throughout the day. And finally, something of great interest to me is also the fact that the difference between the light that we're exposed to indoors and the light that we're exposed to outdoors is enormous. And but we are so adaptable, right? When we walk into a building, at first we might be like, oh, you know, this kind of impact of the switch, right, from the bright light outdoors, even on a cloudy day, and the artificial lighting indoors. But we adapt very quickly. By the time you're at by the elevator, you don't realize anymore how big that difference is. And we know from this particular survey, indoor generation survey, that that all these things are at play, and that basically when you're indoors, you're exposed to one measurement of light is lux. And when we compare that measurement indoors or outdoors, we're talking about something between 300 to even 1,000 lux in very bright environments indoors. Whereas outdoors, the exposure of lux starts at about around 10,000. And for those of you who have SAD lamps, you probably know that that's about the point at which, you want to buy a SAD lamp that is 10,000 lux and above. In terms of connection to place, this is something that my slide doesn't quite show, but okay. We want to have, this is a topic that is highly researched in the environmental psychology literature. There's a lot of, has been a lot of interest over time in how we connect to spaces, to this notion of place. And we know that places that are accessible, engaging, and flexible can increase a sense of agency if a space is accessible, if it is interconnected, if there are walkable areas and we can get to places easily, whether it's with walking or with public transportation. Of course, that increases our sense of agency, right? That we can, that the city, that we belong to the city, we can move around the city in a good way so that we can take advantage of all the resources available in the city. It also, this sense of being able to use the city fully also can increase our sense of belonging and our attachment to place. This connection, again, to the place that we live in increases then social cohesion. If we feel connected to the place, we feel connected to the community. And this may promote behaviors that are pro-social, that is helping others, collaborating, as well as pro-environmental, right? Caring about the environment, whether it's built or natural, and actually taking actions to maintain those environments so that they stay healthy. In terms of social spaces, here we have an example of a space that really kind of focuses everybody on everybody else, right? So the idea is to increase this sense of interaction. It's a kind of a space that kind of centers the attention on everybody else. And as you see, it's not really a green space, but it's a good example of a space that is may encourage social interaction. It's the Piazza del Campo in Siena. Now, one particular condition we are living with now, and something also that addresses this idea of what happens in terms of well-being and spaces that where all the spaces are then brought into one place, is this sense of private and public boundaries. And not only are the fact that many of us who didn't work at home before are now working in, are now bringing work inside the home, but also that those of us who never, who didn't make a choice are now faced with the situation. And there's some interesting research on the notion of how do those boundaries then get worked out when they're not truly, when there's no physical markers for them anymore, when when the boundaries have to be mental. Especially the work and home boundaries in existing within the same place. There's some research on this notion of boundary work theory that has been out there for a long time, but that now is becoming very relevant. And here I'm showing some proposals of the research. There's a particular research on boundary work theory that shows that for some of us, it's not a big problem. For some of us, it's a huge problem. And for most of us, it's somewhere in between. How do we transition from a work mode to home mode, from what we might perceive as a public space to something that might perceive as a private space, and how do we deal with those boundaries when they're virtual, where the virtual boundary might be private or public, but it might not match with the space in which we are accessing that virtual space, right? So the physical space that we're in, we might perceive as either public or private, and then it may be a different kind of level of public or publicity, or say sociability or privacy within the digital space. And this blurred boundary situation is something that has increased in terms of its relevancy in under current conditions as we shelter at home. Finally, the Center for Urban Design and Mental Health has highlighted all these issues that I've mentioned before, and made a special call for making sure that we provide these types of spaces in the urban environment. We talked about green spaces and all the benefits they have for well-being, about pro-social spaces and all the benefits they have in terms of sort of growing social capital and social interaction. We also talked about the possibility that nature green spaces can have for active promoting physical activity. Prior to the pandemic, many of us were thinking a lot about the obesity epidemic, and having active spaces is very important in that regard. And of course, we know that there are additional benefits to psychosocial well-being as well. And finally, something I didn't discuss much in my presentation, but it was talked about prior, was the fact that for many of us, the environments, especially in the urban environments, lack of a sense of safety. And it's important to make sure that we provide that as designers, especially for women. There's some research that has been done, it's called gender mainstreaming, looking at how some part of the population feels less safe than others. In this particular case, they were looking at women. And one of the main concerns for women in the urban environment, and especially in public transportation, was this sense of safety and not feeling that the environment was safe enough. And from a design perspective, there are multiple ways of addressing. One of them is simply lighting, for instance, better lighting in public spaces. Now, finally, there's a long quote that is, I was going to put here, but I didn't, from the World Health Organization in a document called Health as the Pulse of the New Urban Agenda. The New Urban Agenda is a proposal agreed, it's a document agreed to by countries at the United Nations that proposes the city of now, what are the best things that a city can provide now, and what issues should be addressed. And it pointed out that designers, policymakers, and government officials have the opportunity of shaping the city. And that in relationship to that, we must remember that the most important asset of the city is the health of its citizens. And I will leave you with that thought. Thank you so much. That's my presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Nélida. Now we have David Storto from the Spaulding Rehabilitation Network. He's going to describe a really great project. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and thank all of you for tuning in today. Pleased to be with you virtually. I would have preferred to be with you in person, particularly in New York, a city I love so much. But here we are, and we will obviously keep making the best of it and staying safe. So I am not an architect. I'm not a landscape designer. I'm the president of a hospital, a rehabilitation hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. And so I am going to talk to you today about the building of the, we still call it the new Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital, but it is now 7 years old. So I'm going to share my screen here to get started. Spalding is wasn't always called Spaulding. When it was established in September of 1970, it was called the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Hospital. So if you're doing the math, you could see that Spalding just recently celebrated its 50th anniversary. And so we were planning a big gala affair that was going to be held at the Boston Public Library with all sorts of, presentations and all kinds of activities related to the 50th anniversary. Obviously, that's not happening. So we're going to celebrate our 51st anniversary, we hope, in person. We did some modest things virtually and in other respects to just recognize the anniversary. But this was the building as it was then established. And it was a 296 bed facility at its time. The rooms were small, the hallways were narrow. It really was initially built not so much as a hospital, even though it was called a hospital, but was more of a nursing home type environment. So in 43 years later, in 2000, well, let me see here. There we go. Here we go. So here we are in April of 2013, and this is the Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital of today. You can see it's on the Boston Harbor. You can see it's a nice new modern facility. This is another view of it from another angle, but we are surrounded by nature in many, many respects, which I will be talking about. Here's another view. If you were kind of out on a cruise on the Boston Harbor and just kind of coming to shore, you would be able to see Spaulding in the distance. Actually, when you're flying in and out of Logan Airport, you can see Spaulding as you are, depending upon the direction you're coming, on arrival or departure. And this is the angle from, the rear of the building. And actually, as one of the key architects who was involved in the design pointed out, there really is no rear of the building. The rear of the building looks as impressive as the front of the building that people enter. This is the service loading area, ambulance bay, and all. Actually, I do want to point out that one of the registrants on today is Jess Stebbins, who at the time was with Perkins and Will. They were the architects of the building. Jess is now with HDR, and she was the lead architect on point in Boston in designing and being involved with us through the whole construction of the hospital over the course of the couple of years. A little bit about Spaulding. We are one of the world's most significant rehabilitation hospitals. In addition to our patient care, we have major commitment to teaching and research and advocacy on behalf of our patient population. The hospital here is joined in affiliation with another rehabilitation hospital on Cape Cod, about 75 miles from Boston, along with another hospital, long-term care hospital in Cambridge, Massachusetts, for those of you familiar with the geography, on the other side of the Charles River. So together we comprise the Spaulding network, the 3 hospitals along with a skilled nursing facility, and we have an affiliated home care organization. So we have the full continuum of care. For this particular institution here, this particular hospital, We are caring for some of the most catastrophically injured people that have had spinal cord injuries, people that have had traumatic brain injuries, strokes. As a matter of fact, we opened this hospital just 12 days after the tragic Boston Marathon bombings in 2013. So we were still learning our way around this beautiful new facility when we were caring for the 32 of the most catastrophically injured survivors of the Boston Marathon. And because the bombing was an international event, we happened to get a lot of attention to the fact that we had opened the new hospital. When we were designing the hospital, we were committed to various things. Given the nature of what we do and who we are, very much committed to inclusive design within the hospital, which I'll point out as I show you some additional slides. Also to basically resiliency, being on the Boston Harbor and on the waterfront. And given the anticipated useful life of this facility, it's entirely likely we'll experience a hurricane. Actually, when Sandy hit New York, this hospital was being built, and had it taken a slightly different course, we would have been hit then before we even opened the hospital. So all of the mechanicals are on the roof of the hospital. All the windows are operable. It's set back, and we rebuilt the frontage and plantings in a way that provides extra safety in the case of major storms. So this is what the place looked like during World War II. This is Spalding was built in the Charlestown Navy Yard. So the entire area surrounding it was part of the Navy Yard until the mid-90s, when, quite frankly, the area was pretty much abandoned until we started, some 20 years later to rebuild the whole Navy Yard area. But given that it was, and this just gives you an aerial view, so this whole area is the Navy Yard, and the hospital is built here on the area that's called Yard's End. Just another view here of the parcel. So this is where we built the hospital. We have another vacant parcel here that we own that is essentially just being land banked at this point in time for future purposes. Other areas of the Navy Yard have a lot of activity around research that is being conducted by Spaulding and the Massachusetts General Hospital, with whom we are affiliated in the same healthcare system. This parcel here, when we first opened, was empty and owned by the city, and I'll be telling you a little bit later what happened with that development that was almost as exciting to me as building the hospital itself, but more to come on that. This is again just a view, another sense of the land here. So this is what it kind of looked like before we started. It was a brownfield, heavily polluted. And so as we point out here in the title of this presentation, it's we reclaimed the land. We had spent the first 8 months actually remediating the soil, and to the cost of about $25 million. And so, when you think about the area being abandoned, as I said earlier, for as long as it was, part of the reason was because whoever would take responsibility for certain of the parcels that were most heavily polluted had a lot of work ahead to remediate the soil, which we did. This was our groundbreaking. It was October of 2010. These are some of our key stakeholders, trustees, dignitaries. This was our Mayor Menino, our Governor Deval Patrick, a number of other local stakeholders. This is, as we started to dig the hole, and we had, as I pointed out, been sending truckloads of contaminated soil to be remediated, and we did find other good stuff though. And basically, because this was the shipbuilding area of the Navy Yard, we found these live oak timbers. This was one of the pleasant surprises, in addition to the pollutants. We found these timbers that the Navy used to bury in the mud to preserve them for their shipbuilding. And we also found a bunch of granite. So we took a lot of these logs and we sent them to Mystic, Connecticut. Just kind of fortuitously, the world's oldest whaling ship, called the Charles Morgan, was being rebuilt at that point in time. And so they were very, very pleased to receive these timbers that they used in the rebuilding of the whaling ship, which, by the way, came back to Boston a year and a half or so later, where we celebrated and had an event touring the ship for many of our stakeholders within the Spalding community. This is one of the benches that we have inside the hospital, which has obviously been set up and being preserved, but we have these benches all along. When I get to some of the other slides showing the outside of the hospital, you can see how we have benches surrounding our boardwalk and other places. And the granite here, we used a lot of the granite to rebuild the seawall, which we had to do again as part of the plans that we had to make sure that in addition to the setback, in addition to putting all the mechanicals at the top of the building, we needed to rebuild the seawall to protect us in the event of a surge in hurricane-like activity. One of the things that we had been doing in our prior location, which was on the Charles River, was an adaptive water sports program for our patients. And so we wanted to make sure that as we moved to a new facility, we would have water activities, and boy, we sure do have plenty of opportunity here. But the open harbor is not necessarily always a great place for people to be out in kayaks and the like, but there is a little inlet called the Little Mystic Channel that was more protected and suitable for our adaptive sports program. This is a view of the site with different explanations of the programming. So we clearly viewed the hospital from the beginning to be an opportunity for us to both bring in the outside elements and the nature into the facility, as well as be able to bring out our activities, our therapy, our patient population out of the hospital into the surrounding area and into the community, and to bring about an assimilation of the community with the patient population and the staff of the hospital. So all of these areas are areas that the community at large could also utilize. Being built on the waterfront in Boston required that we be a facility of public accommodation on the ground level. So 75% of our first floor activity is open to the public. Our cafe, our restrooms, our multi-purpose rooms are open to the community. The outdoor dining plaza and environmental plaza. And this is a therapy garden. I'll have some other views of it, but basically an opportunity for our patients to be able to have their therapy outdoors, navigating different types of surfaces and all, and I'll show you some of that. We have a putting green on the back of the building, and a variety of opportunities for people to continue to be doing their therapy outside. This is a view of the side view of the hospital. We have tremendous plantings. By the way, the landscape architect was Copley Wolf. So all of the outside design that you see was work that was done by Copley Wolf. This is, behind the tree plantings here is a sculpture that is visible from many directions and very colorful, and that kind of represents the relationship between a therapist and a patient. It was a commissioned work by a sculptor from Baltimore, Maryland. Aside from the ground level activity, we have a number of areas throughout the hospital where we have patios to be able to have people not have to leave the building, but be experiencing the outdoors from various parts of the hospital. This is right outside of our largest therapeutic gymnasium. We have opportunities not only for patients and their family members to experience the outdoors, weather permitting, but we can also hold various events, certainly in the pre-COVID area, in some of these spaces. You could see, the access to nature is just significant in all respects. The light that has been brought in based on the design of the hospital is, from all vantage points. This is the first floor lobby with the outside here, and light is always beaming. Even on a relatively dark gray day, the hospital is remarkably well lit with the natural lighting. These are skylights that are in one of our two largest therapeutic gymnasiums, that in addition to the views that come from these elevated windows, you're bringing in the light with the skylights. It's really a pretty remarkable, inspirational venue to be engaged in therapy. And this is where we can have 50 to 60 of our patients receiving therapy in this space. And they would be people who will have different types of physical limitations. And one of the things that the patients really like about the communal opportunity to do therapy is to see how different people are progressing during the course of their rehabilitation. And one of the things to remember about a rehabilitation hospital, since I'm sure that many of you have not had a lot of exposure, is that the length of stay for people in a rehab hospital is longer than your typical general acute care hospital, where people are usually there on average 3 or 4 or 5 days, whereas people in our hospital on average are there for 3 weeks, and some much longer. For people that have a high spinal cord injury or significant traumatic brain injury, could be in the hospital for a couple of months. So the opportunity to be with their families and friends during opportunities to visit within the facility and outside to experience nature is a major part of the healing experience. These are our green roofs. You can see this is from one of the, obviously the higher floors, but this is on top of the 3rd floor gymnasium that you saw before that had the skylights. This is the lobby, the front lobby, and this is a wall that was created to kind of bring in the natural colors of the water, the greenery. This is a glass design that was done by a guy named Paul Hausberg, who is from the Rhode Island Institute. And it actually, the glass itself was fabricated in Germany based on his design and brought to the hospital. And so this is, what you see as you enter. Outside, we have a lot of different plantings that, again, the key thing here too, aside from the plantings, is the accessibility feature, given the number of our patients who are wheelchair users, to be able to access and participate, in some instances, actually participate in some of the plantings on the terraces from wheelchair height, but otherwise just being able to clearly enjoy the natural plantings. I mentioned the Therapeutic Gardens earlier and talked about the varying services. So you could see cobblestones, you can see just flat surfaces, you can see wood surfaces. There are steps, all of which are intended for our patients to be able to, navigate the various surfaces as part of their therapy. And we've got, benches for people to be seated. Oftentimes the benches are organized in ways so that it's easy for a wheelchair to be adjacent, or in some instances with some of the benches actually centered between two benches, so that the wheelchair user is clearly assimilated with the population of people who aren't using wheelchairs. Again, more of the walking slopes here. You can see what I was referring to earlier. So, and then steps. So again, throughout the whole exterior of the building, there's just the wide variety of opportunity for patients to be able to navigate. I mentioned the seating, so that oftentimes we've got the opportunity for wheelchairs to be easily embedded in the rest of the seating. This is our outdoor dining patio, used primarily by our staff and visitors, but as I noted earlier, as a facility of public accommodation used by the community at large as well. We have a lot of our patients, people who have had brain injuries, people who've had strokes, have various cognitive impairments, and part of the therapeutic opportunity on the exterior too would be to identify the various creatures that we've in bronze embedded right into the rocks and the granite around the facilities. So it's an adventure for not only the patients who are having the opportunity for their cognitive therapy, but frankly, just for the whole community and others to enjoy as they navigate around the hospital. We have interpretive elements that are embedded outside. These are just like markers for patients to be able to know how far they may be ambulating, so they can measure their progress easily by knowing they've covered 3 or 4 markers. There are storyboards around the facility that, well, I covered that quickly. Storyboards that, tell various pieces of the history of the Navy Yard. This particular storyboard here, though, was to talk about the fishery in the harbor, but there's others that talk about the history of the Navy Yard. We have them throughout. That's a storyboard right here. It's one of them, as I was mentioning, talking about the different fish that are native to this particular location. I mentioned earlier that we had a putting green. This is an actual photo with a therapist with patient and using the putting green. These other opportunities for therapy here with occupational therapy, people using the opportunity for upper strengthening. And so we also, I mentioned earlier when I was showing you the photo from the rear saying it was to be developed, that parcel that was in the earlier photo not developed at all is now fully developed. This is a boardwalk that surrounds the whole parcel that had been originally empty. And Menino was the mayor at the time we built the hospital, and this is all city-owned land. A lot of people think that because of how it's an extension of the hospital-owned land, people think of it as ours, but it really is the city's, but it was dedicated to creating a park for the community. This is just another view. This has kind of become a dog park. You can see some dogs here. This is an open space right at the point of the parcel leading up to the harbor. We have a lot of community events utilizing all of that space. This event we call All Aboard is something we do every fall to support our adaptive sports program, and we call it All Aboard because we use different board games to have the community participants be able to enjoy, and it's a family event. Kids really enjoy it and all. But this is, given what you heard earlier about some of the importance of outdoor spaces and playgrounds, one of the most exciting things that happened second to opening the hospital itself was not only the creation of that park and that boardwalk, but a playground that was basically universally accessible to children of all abilities. This was the grand opening of it, ribbon cutting event where the mayor actually attended. This was supported by philanthropy for the most part. Very little city money went into it, but the mayor went out and raised money. Liberty Mutual was the major supporter of it. But this is an opportunity not only for our own pediatric patients with disabilities to be able to enjoy, but for the community at large. And the community uses it quite extensively. And so it's really an opportunity for kids of all abilities to be able to not only enjoy the recreational opportunity, but the exposure between the people with physical limitations and those without is quite extraordinary opportunity to really encourage assimilation and break down some of the stigma and barriers that exist between people that have physical limitations and others. And frankly, it's not only the kids, it's the adults. The adults are in that playground playing quite a bit. This is a view from a distance, of the playground. You can see the swings here. There's opportunity in the carousels to get a wheelchair hooked in. There's opportunities with some of the swings to hook a wheelchair, and so it's really quite a phenomenal park. It was done by designed by Weston and Sampson, for those of you that are interested in that. And here you can just see some of the kids playing on the playground. This is, as I mentioned, the carousel that has the opportunity to bring a wheelchair in. And finally here, I mentioned at the beginning that aside from inclusive design and bringing in nature and bringing our population out to enjoy nature, the whole issue of climate change. So the plantings and the retaining walls are protective barriers. I've mentioned a couple of times already that the mechanicals were all on the upper level on the roof. We have operable windows. If we ever, we think we would never lose power, but thinking back to the Hurricane Katrina and what happened with some of the hospitals there at the time that didn't have operable windows, there are a number of people who, given the temperature at the time, who didn't survive because they couldn't evacuate the hospital. So if we ever needed to, we believe we could, even though we don't think that we would absolutely ever face that challenge. And just some of the other storm surge protection strategies. This is the oxygen tank that's protected. This is just different raised planters and sloped walkways that offer extra protection. So I will stop there and look forward to the panel presentation and any questions that you may have.
Great, thank you very much, David. What an amazing project and fantastic success story. Thank you for sharing this. We will take about a 10-minute break so that all of you can get up, stretch your legs, get a glass of water, some coffee, and let's come back at about 2:45 for the last presentation and then our Q&A. And don't forget, while you're taking your break, think of some great questions to ask all of our panelists for the Q&A box. Thank you, and we'll see you in about 10 minutes. Given everybody enough time to filter back to their desks, and I hope you all had a nice, productive little break. Please don't forget to put together some questions for our panelists in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we'll conclude our presentations today with a presentation from Britt Zuckerman from Dirtworks Landscape Architecture. Britt, take it away.
Thanks, Jen. Hello, and thank you for having me today. I'd like to introduce myself and my firm, Dirtworks. Dirtworks was founded by David Camp, and he has pioneered the use of thoughtful landscape architecture in healthcare environments for many years. And we founded the firm on the concept that the dirt works, that nature is an essential healing partner. I'd like to speak about a recent project in Birmingham, Alabama for the Lakeshore Foundation that I've been working on. The Lakeshore Foundation encourages and provides opportunities for people with disabilities to live a healthy lifestyle through activity, research, advocacy, and health promotion. It's a training facility for Paralympians, and about 1 billion people, or 15% of the worldwide population, experience some form of a disability. So their work is more relevant than ever. We started with understanding the site's topography. It's a pretty challenging site on a rather steep hillside, and this makes it extremely challenging for people with mobility issues to navigate. The heart of the campus was a parking lot, and I think for all landscape architects, we think that's crazy, but it was really sending the wrong ethos to Lakeshore's nearly 4,000 visitors, that the car is king. We really wanted to encourage people to go outside, enjoy nature, and that's a challenging mindset to change in Birmingham when most of the year is spent in air conditioning. And there's a general disinterest to even going out at lunchtime, peak hot sun. So if we want everyone to participate in public life, we really must design and build an inclusive public realm that's accessible to all. Public life can't be just available to the abled, young, or healthy. So this started with breaking up the parking lot and asphalt that was creating an urban heat island. It also created a massive uproar about parking counts. We had to consider adequate wayfinding strategies for people visiting the facility for the first time. The landscape needs to clearly announce arrival. We also need to create a space where the cars are not parking hundreds of feet away from the entrance, so someone who's struggling after a therapy session has a tough journey to their car. During one of our work sessions with the staff at Lakeshore, we got into this discussion about accessible parking versus standard parking. And at one point, Bob, one of the team members, had suggested that we create a third parking typology for people that are zoned accessible, but would rather that space went to someone who really needed it. And this third typology did not follow code requirements of being as close as possible to the building entrances. He was a bronze medal Paralympian in quad rugby. So this really started to challenge how we thought about what does ADA accessible mean. The focus of ADA is so often on the technical aspects of spaces, and they can be a bit uninspiring or unimaginative and work towards the lowest common denominator. I think what Bob was getting at was that we were creating spaces that create dignity for all. I spent a lot of time walking the site and the woodland trails to understand ways to create journeys through nature and throughout the campus, going to and from dorms and rehab facilities. And it was important to understand what it means to have limited mobility. The World Health Organization estimates that about 75 million people, or 1% of the global population, will require a wheelchair. Because the Commons was at the heart of the campus, we had to connect various circulation arteries to the main rehab facility. And this involves some tricky grading around steep slopes. And as I later learned, Alabama has some serious gully washers, so selecting porous paving was a godsend. We were thinking on a macro scale of circulation patterns, but also on a micro scale with contraction joints. So when a chair user is approaching a contraction joint, the microcasters in their wheels can catch and they can topple. So we worked to create a jointing pattern that moved with the flow of traffic. We planted shade trees that will eventually provide respite from the sun, and installed a long serpentine wall that changes elevation and will act as a seat wall, retaining wall, and a fountain pedestal. We also installed double and single rails, seen here before they were painted. So I have mostly construction photos because this project finished during COVID. So it's a little tricky to get the final shots when I'm in New York and they're in Alabama. The single and double rails provide a varying level of security and comfort in areas where the grade may be perceived as more challenging, even though all slopes are under 5%. And this gets to that heart of following comfort over code. Our next section of the project was to create a woodland walk and a bridge through an existing pine grove and tying it to the larger campus. And with this, we also tied it into a project with a local landscape architect, Joel Eliason, who's with Nimrod Long down in Birmingham. And he was fantastic to collaborate on this project. So our goals for this section were to create safe connections through the campus, understand the existing woodland ecosystem and the disturbance to that biome, and then manage the stormwater and erosion. We studied the existing tree health and worked to selectively remove unhealthy pines and preserve the hardwoods, magnolias, and maples. And often our path would take a different turn from our plans because we wanted to save the shade trees. You can't tell in this photo, but it's 103 degrees, and this was in October of last year. The Alabama clay soils were challenging. They like to wash away and retain moisture. So we really wanted the bridge to be a gathering space, an overlook, and a connection through the landscape. We didn't want to design specific areas for people with specific disabilities. All public spaces should work for everyone. They should be comfortable as a baseline. A feeling of safety is that baseline for comfort. But an inclusive sense of belonging helps everyone to feel comfortable in the space. So everyone navigates the built environment differently, with abilities changing across a person's lifespan. We wanted visually impaired persons to hear the varying echo of the boards as they traverse different heights along the bridge, chair users to feel comfortable moving across ipe decking with tight jointing patterns, and people who may have sensitivity to touch to be able to run their hand along a smooth wood railing. One of the things we often talk about at DirtWorks is the code requirement may be 1.5 inches diameter, but sometimes we'll do a 2-inch railing for an arthritic hand or a hand that is unable to grip that railing. again, the soils were just like quicksand and people got caught, and this was an incredibly challenging project to just construct. And now you can kind of start to see some of these nodes in that bridge come together that really invite people to take a moment of pause. So this really isn't just a circulation route, it's a place to observe nature. And probably nowhere is the need for a connection to nature more poignant than in times of illness and crisis, when balance, continuity, and our sense of identity are threatened, and our sense of isolation and vulnerability are really heightened. And at DrPH, we strongly believe that this connection to nature is essential to health, to help reducing stress and depression, provide respite, encourage social connections, and reconnect ourselves to the larger world. And now I'm going to go just a little bit further south to Florida for the L Center of Excellence. This is a game-changing resource in the field of autism, this project. It reflects a carefully researched response to the complexity of autism. The garden's design involved a very significant collaboration with the director of programming and an occupational therapist. So we developed these sensory experiences where the garden enriches motor, sensory, cognitive, and social skills. We had to consider routine, pattern, repetition, and wayfinding to inform the overall design. And we also considered varying degrees of openness and support for discovery, autonomy, and flexible use. All materials and furnishings were considered for therapeutic potential. So the therapeutic rooms or sensory rooms were centrally aligned throughout the garden and then discreetly target the senses. And as a quick refresher of all of the senses we were trying to target, we certainly know about the top 5 of vision, sight, smell, olfaction, taste, gustation, hearing, audition, touch, haptic. But there's vestibular, which has to do with moving gravity, and then proprioception is this moving through space and pressure. We wanted to create spaces that were engaging, safe, and filled with sensory appropriate plants. Because if you have a bunch of children, they're going to find a way to definitely touch the plants. So there's a series of reduced sensory experience rooms to act as a calming counterpoint to those who are hypersensitive or overwhelmed or really active, like that cute little kid in red. And we also want to create spaces of choice, so that in the same space a child group could be running around, another could have a quiet moment of kind of combing his fingers through the grass or feeling that satisfaction of popping a bubble. Other children may be engaged with the sculptural sound chimes or the fragrance of surrounding plantings. So these are kind of particularly special moments that you can break away. The garden also became a place of outdoor instruction, providing opportunities to connect with students who may be challenging to reach during their regular classroom time. And here you can see we organized this garden by understanding these structured spaces, shade structures with tree canopy, focused sensory areas, low sensory areas, places away, places to engage, as well as circulation patterns to accommodate a variety of very active children. So within this lush and safe setting, the garden provides opportunity and choice for each visitor to engage with nature on his or her own terms, in his or her own way, and at their own pace. Our portfolio encompasses the range of the human condition in all its complexities. It almost reflects a human lifespan, from childhood, autism, cancer, to Alzheimer's disease and aging. We've developed this term at DirtWorks, a fabric of health, to express how design and nature transcends any one particular scale. And these individual threads, from the scale of master planning to the intimacy of detailed design, we weave together to create this cohesive whole. So this is a project in Westchester, Briarcliff Manor. It's a continuing care retirement community, and it includes clusters of independent living apartments, assisted living, and skilled nursing units. And the rich landscape heritage of Westchester County inspired this master plan, including hardwood forests, meadows, orchards, rock outcroppings, and fieldstone walls. Some 44 million of the global population suffers from Alzheimer's. 16 million in the United States have a cognitive disability. So this might limit people with diminished sensory or cognitive motor skills to really navigate public spaces or outdoor environments. So we wanted to create predictable pathways. We did this by maintaining clear and understandable design cues in the garden. There are open paths that the staff can really see the residents from any part of the garden. And there's repeated plantings that encourage sensory experience. For example, scent is most highly linked to memory, and we planted lilacs and butterfly bush to kind of bring whimsy, comfort, and a sense of memory to the user experience. The rock garden was designed as this informal gathering space and outdoor classroom for the residents. The art studios and gym are directly adjacent. It was also designed to have plantings traditionally used for medicinal or botanic purposes. We planted echinacea, historically used for upper respiratory infections, witch hazel, a natural astringent, mayapple, historically was used by Native Americans as a purgative, and the roots were used for jaundice, constipation, fevers, and syphilis. And pines historically are used to treat coughs, cold, and joint inflammation. We had to be particularly conscious of what plantings were planted, particularly in the Alzheimer's or memory care gardens, because what is poisonous, what can be ingested, what can be dangerous with thorns, what can cause rash or irritation. So a lot of these considerations really have to go into your planting selection on top of what would work in the site conditions and for the overall design narrative. Exposure to nature and green space is proven to have mental, cognitive, and physical benefits for people of all ages and abilities, but this thoughtful landscape design should provide those benefits throughout the built environment. So we're really wanting to create spaces where people could visit and spend time in and create this sense of community, as well as ecological resilience and support biodiversity. Below the property, there's a large meadow and retention basin. So we created this ecologically resilient retention basin to capture the stormwater, but we also planted over 200 native trees. And there's a series of trails throughout this meadow that the residents are allowed to walk and use for therapeutic adventures. And this has kind of brought many native fauna back to the area. It's pretty wonderful when you're there. You see many butterflies, you see many deer, and the residents have reported really loving being able to have this sense of freedom in nature and go and explore. My last project that I wanted to talk to you guys about is a little bit different. So it's a production studio in Astoria, Queens. So it's not only important to create spaces that heal the individual, but the community and the land. So this is the transformation of urban waterfronts from their industrial legacy into publicly accessible open spaces. We really feel warrants a celebration. So this is in Astoria, Queens, near Steinway Creek. We wanted to highlight the ecological benefits by going beyond the sort of visible and anthropocentric benefits of boardwalks as you're kind of moving through this. The urban waterfront revitalization effort is really focusing on an ecologically rich ecotone where the water and the land are meeting. And as climate change is really becoming more important for our cities to address, I would think, we need to design resilient landscapes that are floodable. So there's a relatively stable shoreline. This is creating this unique habitat opportunity that will support aquatic communities. And the upland shoreline vegetation will transition into intertidal zones with wetland, bioswales, and wet meadows. This supports healthy invertebrate, fish, and water bird communities that often gravitate to these shoreline communities. We hope that this design will engage the community as well as honoring the heritage of the site and heal the land. As I mentioned earlier, it's an industrial brownfield site, so the soils are pretty in need of remediation. Shoreline complexity is a pretty significant physical factor for determining the quality of the habitat. So our design is creating diversity with upland plantings, bioswales, and rock block revetments. The rock block patterning helps epifaunal and benthetic animals live and shelter on these surfaces. And they're often characterized by organic natural materials that have cracks and crevices. And this design includes the establishment of wet meadows and bioswales with coastal native vegetative plantings, salt tolerant species, and successional blooming plantings. We're really hoping to promote the local shorebird population by enhancing habitat at no nesting sites or expanding areas for safe nesting. Our design is including the installation of bat houses, bird houses, and insect hotels. And this, partnered with pollinator-friendly plantings, will help promote the local stewardship of urban ecology. We wanted to avoid further compacting the subgrade and by installing sort of a typical hardscape on grade. And we're doing raised boardwalks and metal catwalks, so we have 100% drainage throughout the project. The pathways will be made of permeable materials, including ADA accessible metal grading, as well as permeable pavers. So for the streetscape design, we're hoping to use all permeable pavers draining into streetscape bioswales. So this is really helping us to create a floodable, resilient design, coupled with the intertidal marsh grasses, shrubs, and upland trees to help create habitat and layers that will buffer from waterward forces. Another component of the project is the phytoremediation of it. So as I mentioned, it's on a former industrial site in Astoria's Steinway neighborhood. Much of the site is built on urban fill materials. The site's historic fills are considered to be the primary contributor to elevated levels of PAH, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. These are a known carcinogen. So we're taking a dual approach to phytoremediation to target both the on-site contaminants present in the site soils, as well as reoccurring contaminants attributed to urban stormwater runoff. So as an organic compound, PAHs can be broken down. So this is achieved specifically when an active, healthy soil microbiome metabolizes organic compounds. So to accelerate this natural process of degradation, we have selected deep-rooted grasses that will both aerate the soil and support soil microbial life. So phytoremediation, as we all know, is a lengthy and uncertain process. But this is an effort that is relatively affordable and readily adapted to other sites throughout the city that also rest on urban fill. So together, these efforts may incrementally improve soil health and contribute to the health of urban waterways, in improving habitats and the human community and well-being. So we think this is an important gesture. We are also developing a number of green roofs and terraces so that nature is woven throughout the building. Green roofs help combat several issues created by urban overdevelopment. They collect stormwater, lower ambient air temperatures, conserve energy, and dampen sound. So sound is a particular concern in this project because pervasive noise from transportation and other sources interferes with the transmission of animal sounds that signal courtship, territory, and predators. And certain birds can alter their vocalization to compensate for urban noise. Can you imagine what human beings are altering to combat urban noise? So by creating dense plantings with berm soil, this will help mitigate these acoustical conflicts. And in closing, I hope you'll start to think about how nature is not only healing for the individual, the community, but also for the land. We know that access to nature is healing. We've studied E.O. Wilson, biophilia, room with a window. As designers, we can really create thoughtful spaces that bring dignity to those in distress or illness, but also you, me, and our environment. Whether it's encouraging someone in Alabama to take their lunch outside on a hot day, or children with autism finding moments of pause in a hectic learning day, or creating a sense of safety as we age in place, or we age in communities. Our gardens really matter because nature is healing. So that concludes my lecture. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Brett. Beautiful work, very thoughtful designs, and I absolutely love the combination of human health and environmental health, all packaged in one. So thank you very much. So that does conclude our presentation portion of today's 4 CEUs and a Beer event. And because we're all sitting here for about 4 hours in a chair in front of a computer, it's a really great opportunity to take advantage of the fact that we're sitting in front of a computer and maybe do some stretching, do some deep breathing. That's also providing wellness while you don't even have to get up. So something everybody can do. I think what we'll do now is get into our question and answer period. We do have several questions already lined up. I will also encourage you to add your own questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom panel. And if you have another question that's a follow-up to a question already asked, feel free to also ask that as well. So we've got plenty of time to really dive in and ask our panelists lots of questions. So with that, let me just open up my question screen. Okay, question number 1. And this is for all panelists. So all the presentations really have mentioned the benefits of our engagement with nature. The projects that we've seen demonstrate beautifully blurred lines between human wellness as well as environmental and climate health. So what strategies do you feel designers must put at the forefront of their own projects to help elevate wellness across all boundaries?
I can start it off from a non-designer perspective, which is always treading into scary territory here. But I think one of the things is sort of human-centric perspective, right? So who are the people who are going to be served by the space? I think both David and Britt so eloquently identified those features of their spaces that reflected the needs, the unique needs of the population across the lifespan, whether children to sort of older adults. So the question that comes in, you know, at least in our question of like public space, what is the mechanism to invite a participatory process in that design? And that could be traditionally seen as something that, you know, where community members go to city council to advocate for certain aspects of parks and green space. But that path or that approach is not always one that's inclusive of all communities. And so can we use, for example, public art or, you know, working with, let's say, your local community health center or you know, as the Green Schoolyards program does, leveraging places and spaces that we wouldn't normally be, and people who wouldn't be usually thought of as part of that conversation to drive that agenda forward. And leveraging approaches such as sort of public art an artist to help navigate that conversation.
Yeah, I just wanted to, am I unmuted? Yes. Build up on what Sadiya mentioned. I also follow a little bit issues related to aging, and I think it's interesting, just exactly in this notion of participatory design. To clearly on the projects that were discussed today, there has been an attention to what the needs are of people who are going to be using those spaces. But for example, in Singapore, that has a very kind of extensive program for aging, for instance, one of the things they've been doing is at the planning level, they've brought in older adults to look over plans. They explain how the plans work, and they allow them to have a say given their own particular experience. So, you know, sort of very early on the stages, beginning stages of a project, for instance, to bring those voices in can really add from, you know, from the experience of the users or the people for whom the space is being designed. That might be a good thing to keep in mind, that that's always a possibility. And it's an unusual way of going about starting a project, but it probably can add a lot to the thinking process as you make design decisions.
We did various things, starting with, our architects rolled around in wheelchairs for a day to be able to, you know, experience from wheelchair height and all of the challenges associated with wheelchair users to just be able to be up, you know, up front and you know, personal with it. Jess Stebbins, who's on this included, participated in that. But we also had, you know, wheelchair users who were part of groups that, you know, evaluated various points, not only at the beginning of the project, but throughout. One very classic example of you know, their involvement was, we were well along in the construction of the hospital and had a group of wheelchair users come into that gymnasium, that, you know, one with the skylights that I showed you, that magnificent, inspiring environment. And lo and behold, the sill was so high that from wheelchair height, you couldn't see over it. At least not on one of the, you know, walls. I mean, you could from one side, but not the other. So we had to make a decision at that point in time what we were going to do. Well, we took it apart, and at a cost of an additional $300,000 or so, made it, you know, wheelchair height accessible. So that was, and we also had the benefit of having the ability to set up different designs of different patient rooms at our hospital in Cambridge. We had a vacant building there, so we actually had different setups with different features. All of our patient rooms have lifts in them, and so we had different types of lifts in the mock-up of rooms. All of us, you know, from the perspective, I think, of the architects and the staff, really felt as though a lift system that was continuous, throughout the room was going to be the one selected. But wheelchair users, therapists, nurses who had the opportunity to test out both chose the other one that would require a transfer from one track to another, only because it gave broader access to all parts of the room. So, you know, we got a lot of input along the way from user groups, and had our architects, experience from wheelchair height, the experience, so that, they could they could factor that into the design.
And I was gonna follow up with that. I think it's it's really understanding your user group and understanding intimately how they're using the space. And that I think can be accomplished through observation, as well as talking to the group and specialists. I think, what Sadiya was getting at is that not everyone vocalizes how they use the space. Not everyone shows up to the community meeting or the planning board session. And so I think it really takes a thoughtful approach of sitting in the space, walking the space, going there at different times of day, different seasons, and seeing how people are using it, and then adapting. And I think, as David was saying, the design process really doesn't end at construction documents. It's going on through construction, and we've had a little bit of post-occupancy design as well on a number of our projects.
And I would just add, I think the benefit of that is not just the fact that you get more information about how the spaces are actually used, but the benefit for those who know that their input is being taken care into account is also important.
Yeah, like for example, when I was in Alabama, I think every single person I spoke to told me it gets hot down here, and they couldn't fathom how like a little pale woman from New York could understand that it really gets hot. And as soon as I was spending October down there, I realized it's beyond just shade trees. It's layers of shade trees. It's different angles of sun. It's also placement of the fountains so that the humidity isn't being trapped beneath a canopy. It's a lot of different considerations that I just wouldn't have known studying it from afar or just hearing them say it. It was experiencing it in person and really being there.
I think to build on Nélida's point also, that process of engagement can actually build towards other forms of collective efficacy, right? So in public health, we often talk about sort of self-efficacy, your ability to think that you can make a change in a certain behavior. But then there's also this context of community efficacy. And so when we have something like a collective participatory process that's informing the design of something that has the opportunity to then build indeed more social capital, which we've sort of talked about throughout these presentations, but also the ability of making change happen with and for your own community. And we've definitely seen examples of that in terms of a project in Wenatchee, Washington, at the Trust for Public Land, where it was the community participatory design that came together to sort of revitalize an existing park that was informed by a predominantly migrant community of Latinx community members, turned into a program that then was able to come together again during midterm elections, actually, to turn out a threefold increase in Latinx voters, simply because they had already come together. And that's the same group that's actually being activated to advocate for COVID response for the migrant workers who are, quite honestly, being, not so well treated during this pandemic. So these pieces of, I really think of it in such a broader scale of, design, yes, informs our individual sort of use and utilization of the space, but has the potential to build towards far more as well within the community.
All right, I think that leads into a question from our viewers. Very interesting presentations. Thank you. David and Britt in particular, have you utilized particular details or furnishings in your project that have been successful in helping your user groups as they heal?
Yeah, absolutely. Furniture is one of the things we think about extensively for different populations. So for elder care design, a lot of the considerations that we'll think about are comfort, the weight of the chair. So I have a ridiculous video on my phone that I had to send to one of our groups, because I'm pulling the chair. It has to be comfortable enough that you could pull it in and out of the sun. You can make it has enough strength in the arms that you could use to get in and out of it and to lean on it. But it also has to be lightweight enough that you can move it while also not tipping over in the wind. So weight is a big consideration. We also consider the materiality. Metal is incredibly durable. Any public space wants to use metal because it has very low maintenance, but it's a little tough on elderly bones. So we try to tend towards wood or some softer materials. We love to try and get fabric. Fortunately for my Lakeshore project in Alabama, I was allowed to get fabric cushions. They had the budget for it, and they have the maintenance staff that will take care that they don't fly away, and that they'll take them in the winter. They don't have as severe a winter as we do in the Northeast. So fabric is a really wonderful choice, but it's not often an option in highly public spaces. We also consider the placement of the back, at what angle, low back, steep angle. So some of the very sexy modern furniture really just isn't appropriate for an aging population. Children, we really consider tamper-proof material, so tamper-proof hardware. We consider durability. Kids can climb and jump off of it. So really fabric isn't appropriate often for children, because they can spill, they can rip, they can get caught on it. So safety and comfort are a lot of our major considerations with furnishings. In terms of other details that we really consider, I could keep going on and on. I'll let David jump in, but I can talk about hardscape and railings and paving patterns and all that, but I'll pass it to David now for furniture.
Well, aside from furnishings, I mean, just in terms of details, I mentioned inclusive design being a high priority. So, all of our counters are, have cuts for wheelchairs so that people are, looking at one another eye to eye, as opposed to people in wheelchairs looking up. We have motion detectors on the vast majority of the doors throughout the hospital, so that people with limited manual dexterity, particularly spinal cord patients, can, if they can just wave and open the doors, which, by the way, in the era of COVID have come in handy for a lot of people who, are just obviously cautious about touching any kind of surface these days. So, that's just, kind of through the kind of permeated the design throughout the facility. In terms of furnishings in particular, one of the things that, was important for our patients, and we have all single private rooms, was the ability for a family member to be able to stay over. So we wanted to have furnishings that were multi-use. So we have sofas that are folded hide beds. We have recliner chairs that are very, very comfortable for one to be able to sleep in should they be spending the night. This is particularly important for our pediatric population, where we oftentimes will have a parent that's actually staying through the whole course of the child's stay, but also for some of our adult patients as well, who have a family member who may periodically want to be staying over. We also, needed to be sensitive to the ability of some of our patients who are ambulatory, not wheelchair users, but who would have limited ability to sit into a traditional height chair and then be able to get up. So we have a lot of, particularly in our communal areas, our waiting rooms, chairs that are elevated so that it's possible for that rheumatoid arthritis patient who's ambulating with a cane, who, if they sat in a traditional chair, wouldn't really be able to get up on their own, even with the cane. So they can kind of lean in on the chair and still be able to independently be able to sit and stand. So that was important. Because we have people in wheelchairs, a lot of times big motorized wheelchairs, we needed to have surfaces for people to be able to, bang into and then be able to easily repair. That's been, that's an ongoing challenge, particularly in a spinal cord unit of the hospital where you have some of the biggest motorized wheelchairs. So, variety of things that, were considered as we furnished the hospital and designed it.
And to build off of that materiality of durability, we at DirtWorks often consider our hardscape materials pretty carefully. For example, the coefficient of friction is really important, but also the color of the paving is important. One of the things we've studied is that aging eyes don't adapt well to large transitions of sunlight. So particularly at door entrances and exits, we like to try and do either a medium toned paving with dappled light, and we do successive exposure to light. So it'll be fairly shady, dappled light, full sun, so you can transition your eyes. And that helps with that, that solar reflectivity kind of blinding you and hitting you with the sun. And it allows someone who may be just venturing outside to kind of move out at their own pace and not get so exposed, as well as that coefficient of friction, so surfaces aren't too slippery and dangerous. And those are some of our materiality considerations too.
I think it's interesting that all these approaches, sort of lead towards the notion of universal design. I think David mentioned inclusive design, but that's one of the things I love. I mean, it's about the idea of universal design is that it can serve multiple needs. And it's also always very challenging, right? Because of all these differences and all this, like all the granularity of design decisions that Britt is bringing up and David also mentioned. But when you can have some kind of answer or approach that can include multiple needs, then you have something that can be like a potentially one design that addresses multiple different types of uses. And ideally, that would be, I'm sure there's situations in which you have to be very specific as to how something is designed for this particular populations. But that's something of interest to point out. I've always thought that it's interesting, for example, curb ramps that are often so mentioned in the sense of maybe helping someone with a wheelchair, but having been a mom with a stroller, I really was very happy to see them. And I know that people with canes would have an advantage. I even think that people who just, when you're in the city, in New York City, you see that everybody that has a heavy load and needs to push it in some kind of cart is also very happy to see a curb ramp there. So that kind of a thinking of sort of serving multiple needs whenever possible is important, I think.
I think that also brings up a really interesting question. Hearing you all speak about all the different various considerations that you have to have in order to have universal and inclusive design. Where does the line between having something be multi-purpose? For example, in an urban environment, you don't have a lot of space. So sometimes you aren't able to create the long sweeping ramps, and you don't have the ability to facilitate the need of every individual. So where does that line between designing more universally and multi-purpose versus being very specific in the design solutions for specific needs? How do we design for all of these different needs in a limited amount of space and budget, I should say?
Well, I think one of the things that we really discussed a lot on my Lakeshore project is we didn't want to create a space that was specific for certain populations with certain disabilities. So I think it's important to create spaces that are welcoming to all, but not on a very blatant or overly conscious level. It shouldn't be that this is your entrance and this is this person's entrance, or this is your path and this is my staircase. It should feel welcoming to all and inclusive to all. And I think doing it at an economy of space is a particularly challenging aspect. You know, you got to get the run in for the ramp. We'd all love to do an under 5% ramp. It's a little bit easier, but I think it's putting in places of pause, anticipating that the person may get tired at sooner than the 30-foot run. And so I think it takes an individual approach to each site, but also really considering that this should feel universal or welcoming to all groups.
Yeah, I think I was thinking in that direction, right? It's a very difficult it all depends. It's always the best answer, right? It depends on the particular situation. I thought it was so interesting, this idea. Now so much of design is going towards this touch-free or touchless things, and it's interesting that it's for completely different reasons, right? Because now we're concerned about touching surfaces, not because we have difficulty doing it, but because we're concerned about possible contagion. So I think you'll have to look at each individual case, I suppose. It isn't really a design situation, but in some cases it's interesting that an answer can actually address very, very completely unrelated needs, right? So that particular case is interesting to me, that because I'm looking a little bit at what the changes, design decisions are being affected by COVID, for instance, and going towards touchless and technology. There's a big interest towards that. So that brought that to my mind in that particular case.
Yeah, I guess to respond to the question again about how you consider, all needs. So, I mean, a small thing. So, every patient room has a room number. Okay, so for a visitor who's coming to see someone, they may know they're going to see so and so in room 412. But if the person in room 412 has cognitive impairment that impedes their ability to recall numbers very well, but can understand a graphic, all of our rooms, in addition to a number, have some type of symbol. It might be an airplane, might be a duck, whatever. So the patient might remember, I'm in the airplane room. And so that's kind of another, example of that, the features that kind of attend to, all people who are involved in the facility in whatever respect.
And just to tie in that idea to different needs that you never think about, I always think of this case in terms of universal design, where, if you've been to Mexico City, you'll see that a lot of the subway stops have not just the name of the stop, right? But they also have a graphic. And when I sort of asked about it, it's a nice thing, because sometimes you'll see the graphic more than anything. And I ended up just actually referring to the graphic most of the time, because it's so fast, so easy, it's there, it's big. And I was told that one of the main incentives toward that was a concern many, many years ago, that the different levels of literacy, right? So that someone who has no problem reading the station, with the actual name of it, but for various levels, right? Just seeing this, the symbol itself would be enough to be able to maneuver easily. So it's it kind of connects to this idea of, serving a spectrum of needs. But someone, let's say for me, I took advantage of that. And sometimes if I needed very quickly to look at, sort of identify a station, just the symbol itself, was what I went for.
It also reminds me that, there are a lot of people that are colorblind, and there are a lot of people that can't differentiate between low contrast objects. And a friend of mine who works for a playground manufacturer had mentioned that using high contrast colors in your play equipment and the fitness equipment more specifically helps to people visualize that, oh, there's a post, right here. You don't want to like walk into the post. So if you have like a, green safety surfacing and you've got trees in the background and green shrubs in the background, you don't want to use green for your posts. You want to use something that completely contrasts, yellow and orange, bright colors. I want to actually go back to sort of at the beginning of our presentations. We talked a little bit about the fact that so many people are spending a tremendous amount of time in front of screens and other media sources. As designers, how do we get people to step away from screens and media in order to improve overall health? Is there a way to embrace technology while also maintaining a connection to nature? What ideas do you have to achieve this?
I'm probably the worst person to go first because I absolutely hate technology in the landscape. I'm like 100% one of those people that feels that we should have less screen time and disengage from screens and technology. I've had a lot of clients, particularly when I was doing high-end residential, that would want a television outside, or clients that really want to have like spaces where they can have their phones, have Wi-Fi outside. So I think it's understanding having charging outlets and Wi-Fi stations for a sense of safety and connectedness for example, people who want to work outside and extend their workspace outdoors. So particularly during COVID, I think it's wonderful that we take laptops outdoors and we're no longer kind of chained to our desk. But at the same time, we're really creating an offices everywhere. And then we're not having that meaningful time in nature where we're having the forest bathing and those experiences of 15 minutes of meaningful time, 45 minutes of meaningful time. I don't want to sit in a park scrolling on my phone. I really want to be there and experience it. I want to like get the fresh air. So I've always been against bringing technology into nature, aside from maybe a wayfinding strategy or for safety, that lights turn on as you approach. That type of not technology I'm into, but I don't want to like set up outdoor screens and televisions everywhere.
So no Pokemon Go. You're not a fan of Pokemon
Yeah,
no. Okay, good.
I can comment on this from the public health side, Jennifer, if that's helpful. I think there's, obviously there's sort of design, build, and activation or programming as we think about public space and the intersection with health. And going back to our earlier point that design matters, right? If we have a responsive design from the get-go, you're automatically getting people more and more engaged in their outdoor space, right? So build, we've talked about those features, David and Brett in particular, and then Nélida at sort of the city level. But then when it comes to activation and programming, we know that is a key component of facilitating space outdoors. So how accessible that is when it comes to both cost and how accessible that is when it comes to proximity, just given differences in our urban histories, right? So how can we ensure that is both tailored and targeted? And I think one of the key things in that is, as we think about this engagement with nature, I often think about it from like close to home to sort of large landscapes, large parks, et cetera. How can we create that across the lifespan? And as much as we can do to build that into schools, build that into existing places that people spend their time, into work, I think I'm of the belief that that will then ensure that they're doing that in their leisure time as well.
Yeah, I talked a bit about the therapeutic trails, outside the hospital that are used, weather permitting, but a major initiative, and it's supported through philanthropy, is our adaptive sports program. I mentioned the water aspect of it, which obviously was important in the selection of the location for the new hospital, but we have sports year round. So we're bringing our patients outdoors all year. In addition to the water sports and biking, we have, snowboarding and skiing in nearby, places. We really find that that's, aside from the traditional kind of core therapies in a rehab hospital of, physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech, adaptive sports is in many instances the person's, real intense, genuine experience of kind of regaining, their sense of self and their independence. In some instances, it's a matter of doing something they never thought they'd be able to do again. In some instances, it's people doing it for the first time that even prior to their injury or illness, they weren't necessarily all that athletic, and find that it is after the onset of their disability, an opportunity that they never realized before. And it's not only the person, but their loved ones, their family, their friends who get to observe them. And it's the same kind of experience, observing your child, your spouse, your brother, sister, being able to do something again that, they feared they'd never be able to do again. And the joy that brings, to that broader social network that's so important. We think of rehabilitation as, very much a family affair and a social affair. It's not just about the person with the injury or the illness. It's about their whole social network. And so we work with that whole social network, both to help them as well as to help the person with the injury.
And I would just add that, there's something wonderful about the mobility of media, right? That you can move around, but somehow now we're tethered to the media itself. So I don't know. I think I agree with Britt. I'm also like, okay, when you're outdoors, you're outdoors, or when you're in nature, you're in nature, and maybe you should just keep the technology just as a useful add-on to to being outdoors. But to me, what's interesting is that, in generations back, I can think of my mom even, just the sense of outdoors being healthy was just so obvious, right? That you just, outdoors healthy, go out, for whatever. And that somehow over time, that has kind of like, not so much up on the consciousness up until just recently, right? With the pandemic, suddenly it's like, outdoors is good. And I think just for that, that has been, to me, it's sort of like a nice reminder that we do, there are advantages to being outdoors, even if it is with your laptop or your phone. But I think ideally, if we could, I would encourage the disconnection somehow. It's definitely better if you sit outside and interact with your phone than if you sit in a dark room indoors. But you're not getting the full benefit of really engaging, of reducing the information overload that you're experiencing, and also of sort of regenerating, having that restorative effect of nature if you're still sort of so connected to your media.
Sorry, kind of a follow-up to what you were just saying, Nélida. We are in a pandemic right now. I think it's more evident than ever before that we need to be outdoors, that we need to have nature, we need to have social interaction and engagement on whatever level that may be. However, there are so many restrictions right now and fears really for people to be in a social setting, within close proximity to each other, engaging even with our neighbors. What examples, and I'm sure that we're 7 months into this. We've all seen lots of great examples of how businesses have gotten creative in order to try to improve their business, improve the economy. So what examples of pro-social spaces have you seen lately that still adhere to physical distancing, but seem to have a really good or successful level of engagement for people, for community? Sadiya?
I think one thing that just comes to mind is that the fact that streets were closed off when people aren't driving their cars, and you had places and spaces which were usually very car-centric returning to this place and space of being human-centric. And that, opens up space for play, opens up space for activity, opens up space for simply spending time so that you're sort of getting out of the house. And disconnecting from technology, as Britt was talking about. And that in and of itself is a form of both resilience and sort of stress relief. So how do we then think about designing our streets that are very integrated with nature, that are sort of an extension of the park, and bringing nature into all of those avenues and venues where normally we wouldn't?
Well, I don't know. I think we will find out, because we're living it now. It's kind of a little bit hard to step back. But even though we are distanced, I have seen more people just be outside. I live in an area where it used to be kind of funny. I knew everybody who walked because there were only a handful of people. And now, even though we're a distance away, we see each other, walking, there's a little nature trail, walking, dogs and maybe jogging or whatever. And I think it's that sense, that sense is to some extent there, even though we're not getting close and talking maybe, as everyone is trying to just stay within their, familiar pods. Just that the fact that we're out there, even sort of physically a distance apart, there's some benefit to that, and I'm not sure. You probably heard that the percentage of people that feel they have some kind of well-being impact because of this distancing effort has grown exponentially. Last night I heard that Google searches regarding depression and anxiety, I think went up like 650%, something crazy. So clearly people are feeling it. But I think we'll understand it better as time goes along, because we're in that moment, we're living it, and every month that goes by, we're living it at a higher level, and for a longer period of time.
I would also add that there are a couple of wonderful things that are coming out of this. That our default is to stay inside, and I think the outdoor classroom is pretty exciting. Like I know a couple of parents that have young children, and they took them out of urban schools, and they're up in the country where my parents are, and they're going to be outdoors the whole school day through winter. And that's the standard curriculum. It hasn't really been adjusted because of COVID, but now there's just an incredible enrollment. So the standard is that we have to be in a classroom, but now it's really, it's changing how we dress for the outdoors, that we can be outside with a couple more layers on. It's certainly, the gas heaters for outdoor dining. But it's just, I think it's asking us to be a little bit more imaginative and rethink our default. One of the things that I love is I'm seeing like dance classes outdoors, and a lot more yoga classes. And the default has always been to take a dance class on a sprung floor with a great stereo system. And now it's like we're really reclaiming these pockets of outdoor space that would have been maybe not as utilized, and it's now becoming the norm. So I'm kind of loving that, and the little pocket parks or parklets with parking. And I think it's a really nice catalyst for maybe rethinking some of our urban spaces. On a countryside, because I'm in Hudson, New York right now, we're pretty rural, but we're packed with leaf peepers right now. And one of the things that's really magical is that the default activity for socialization is going for a hike. It's not getting a drink. And I kind of love that shift of how we're now interacting and finding commonalities to bond with our peer groups or our family. We have to be outdoors and 6 feet apart. But outdoors is the key part, which is pretty spectacular.
And yeah, I wonder, I mean, it's very interesting that all these things are happening. You mentioned that kindergarten or whatever was early childhood, maybe, well, we're a classroom. I know that this is something that is very common in the northern, northern European countries, and the Nordic countries, Scandinavian. And I actually watched a very nice documentary on something that's called forest kindergarten. And they go to the forest. That's what the kindergarten is about. And that's just because that's something that people value and actually send their children to this type of kindergarten. But I'm wondering, while we're doing all these changes, which I think are really great, as I'm saying, is to remind us that being outdoors is good. What the long-term effect will be if we will just go back to things as they were before, once we find a cure, hopefully, or if there will be a more significant sort of long-lasting reevaluation of being outdoors. And I remember when I was younger, I mean, if it was cold, you just put on a sweater, and now it's like, oh no, there's something wrong with the temperature, right? You gotta wear a t-shirt indoors, right? Sort of, if we will go back to a reevaluation of saying, yes, it can be a little cold, and you can put on a coat, and you can still, enjoy the outdoors.
Yeah, and Adrian commented about, the urban flight to country areas with the classrooms. The funny thing is the family that's in the country with my parents, the child was already enrolled in his Brooklyn community, where he did every school day outside, full snowsuit, no matter what. Same with like a couple of schools. I know the Waldorf school loves doing that. I'm a Montessori kid, so we had that as well. So it's not just in country locations. These kids spend all day in Brooklyn parks as well. So I think it's wonderful that we're taking outdoor classrooms, just to follow up to Adrian and Nélida's comments.
You know, another thing that's bringing people out, and I don't have hard data at my fingertips here, but I have read some things that really show that there are an increased number of people who are having dogs. I mean, anecdotally, I just see so many puppies around. I live in the city in Boston, in a particular dog-friendly area. So I wouldn't necessarily generalize from it, but there do seem to be a lot more pet owners. Obviously, people who live alone and who are feeling isolated, it's, you know, it's certainly, you know, an opportunity to have companionship of a pet. But when you have one, you've got to get out. You know, you've got to get out several times. And, you know, that gives you an opportunity to enjoy nature, meet other pet owners, and socialize in a different kind of way. It's kind of like, instead of the drink, it's the hike, it's the let's walk dogs together.
David, that's actually funny that you said that, because there have been studies comparing dog versus cat ownership and health, and puppy ownership, dog ownership is definitely more closely associated. It's not, I wouldn't put it out there as the most robust study in the world, but definitely exists out there.
And also, what I like about that example is now that will be a long-term, unless you are very heartless, that will be a long-term commitment or a long-term change in your life, right? Because now, pandemic or no, now you've got the dog, you're going to have to continue walking that dog. So hopefully, I mean, there's a lifestyle change that will endure beyond the needs of the time right now.
Yeah, I wanted to also comment about the outdoor classrooms and being creative. There's a school on the Upper West Side that has a greenhouse that has a door that goes to rooftop space. They have converted that rooftop space into an outdoor classroom, and it's surrounded by raised garden beds, and they have some portable canopies, just those, you know, the typical kind of patio canopies that you put over your table and chairs outside from, you know, Home Depot or whatever. And they're using those to kind of protect from the sun, and they're having classes outside. They're sitting on little stools and upside down buckets, and they're happy. They're loving it. So that's
Jennifer,
a great point.
Yeah, I think one of those things, sort of building on Nélida's point, Jennifer, your points, there's this concept in public health of life course outcomes, that what happens early in life affects your long-term trajectory, right? And so two things that I think about is that is both in terms of habits and in terms of exposure. So the habits that we build early in life, for example, if you're building physical activity in quite early, if you're building in exposure to nature quite early, that tends to sustain and maintain as much as possible. I'm sort of curious from Nélida, your perspective and the knowledge of the literature, if you've seen that kind of life course or longitudinal type of studies looking specifically at the exposure to nature across the lifespan and how it's informed health and well-being, whether it's early or and how it informs life later.
No, I haven't, but it's a really good question. It's sort of long-term. For example, you know, if you are exposed to the use of nature when you're very young, will you now, sort of maintain that kind of connection to nature or a liking of nature, or even just will it pop into your mind more likely that that certain activities can be done outside, right? But it made me think also this comment of the rooftop that, well, maybe now just sort of rediscovering or rethinking what other spaces, especially when you're in an urban environment, what other spaces can bring me to nature. And I think sometimes roofs maybe not thought of as much as they could be, because they're there and they could be used and they could be helpful in so many ways, right? In terms of even energy conservation, you know, the way you treat them. It would be helpful in that way, but now also in terms of being used as an outdoor space that is available, you know, where, you know, spaces where they're very built up in the city.
I have a couple of follow-up questions that kind of fall along the same lines. I'm going to jump to one of our attendees' questions here. In the context of an ongoing pandemic and deep municipal budget cuts, can you speak to design solutions that get people outdoors and social in a safe, environmentally sound manner that can be constructed quickly and affordably? So it's kind of like, what can we do with little money and lots of restrictions and lots of challenges in a small amount of space? Go.
Well, one of them is rediscover your roof. I suppose that would be, it could be somewhat depending on the condition of your roof. It could be possibly not as expensive as other options. I think Sadiya mentioned just redefining your street space, right? That's, there's some cost involved, but it's also something that, you know, with a low budget, you can do things to it. I've seen some very creative ways where I live in terms of the restaurants just taking up parking spaces for sitting areas for restaurants, right? So kind of like redefining or sort of remarking spaces that are there already as spaces to be used for other activities that could take place indoors would be one way of doing it. And that would be at the policy level, right? Where you say, okay, we're going to take, since fewer people are commuting, let's say, let's take some of the parking space for either for restaurants or for just sitting areas or something like that.
I would also add that community gardens are a great opportunity to champion. I love green roofs, but they're not fast for approvals just because of the engineering. But I think we could possibly champion some sort of vacant lot community garden in urban environments for budget cuts that helps put the community as a really essential partner in developing the landscape and having a sense of ownership over it. So I think that would be a great addition to the parklets.
I like that, Britt. There's actually research that was done, and I'm sure folks are familiar with it, but it was a really robust study, a randomly controlled trial across all of Philadelphia, where they looked at blighted sort of micro parks, and they did 3 different interventions. One was a control group, they didn't touch it at all. A second one was where they just sort of picked up the trash. And then third one was about a $500 intervention, putting up a fence, cleaning it up. And they found, this is Dr. Gina South out of University of Pennsylvania, found improvements in social well-being of the community members itself. And then they also found, they didn't know they were being studied in association with this specific intervention, as well as crime reduction. So both in terms of perceived crime as well as actual crime reduction. So for a $500 intervention, I think that's sort of a really strong return on investment, both in terms of healthcare and well-being.
Okay. Another question, and actually, we've got several questions. This is great. Lots of great content to discuss here. Let's also talk about how we can make these spaces more equitable. You know, we talked about open streets. We talked about green roofs. You know, green roofs, you know, traditionally are, you know, private unless it's on top of a civic or public building. So not quite equitable. Not every building can afford to do a green roof. I wish they could. I wish that green roofs were mandatory on every building. But things like the Open Streets program, you know, sometimes it's located in neighborhoods where there's lots of community, lots of community groups, lots of business improvement districts. And those ones seem to be doing pretty well, but you know, not every neighborhood has a community activist that is speaking for them to open up streets in their neighborhood. So how can we, especially in the urban environment, utilize those spaces, those vacant lots for community gardens, the parking spaces that are underutilized, even a short one-way street between two avenue blocks that maybe doesn't get a lot of traffic on it, close it off. Let's, you know, claim that for public space. But how do we make this more equitable? Are there ideas that you might have for ways that we can bring people together in all neighborhoods?
I think one thing that's sort of very long-term pipeline, but also sort of really needs to be we need to think about thoughtfully very early on, is who is actually making the decisions for whom. Are members of communities, Black and Brown communities, represented in the field of whether it's healthcare or landscape architecture, and how that actually plays a key role in who is being designed for and by whom, and how those planning decisions, especially master plans that have implications for, you know, years down the line, are informed. So I think there's sort of that macro level, but really critical piece that if we don't want to return to pre-COVID times, right? It wasn't a good time for everyone. And so how do we actually think about that from a justice perspective as we move forward?
I think from a design perspective, you can design spaces, as we mentioned, so sort of that serve multiple needs. But from a socioeconomic equity perspective, I think you have to think more in terms of social policy, and, you know, sort of government policies to allocate funds for neighborhoods that may not have, you know, the funds that are needed.
And I don't know a lot of detail about this, but I have sort of two comments. One is, I believe Minneapolis's park plan was looking specifically at equity at the center of this work. And so how do we, taking those innovative approaches in terms of how design is informed through those participatory processes. The second thing is, I think as Nélida is saying, that there's resources that need to be considered, obviously quality of space. And I have yet to see a specific sort of way to assess or measure quality of parks in a way that is sort of benefits health specifically, right? So, you know, is it at a certain level of, for example, biodiversity, because we know biodiversity improves mental health, right? Are there specific targets of making sure that there is a walking loop that all parks must have in order to promote physical activity? Are there specific design features? And that might be something that will help us think about, you know, sort of beyond access, how quality is informing our outcomes.
All right, so I also have my own kind of question, and then that kind of follows up to what we were just talking about, as well as a viewer question. You know, we're in a pandemic. It's likely not going to completely go away. May never completely go away. You know, while we might hopefully get over it for the most part, it's forcing us to really think about design and really thinking about our public spaces in a completely different way. You know, we really need to be thinking about the future of how we design our public spaces, our institutional spaces, and how we can accommodate for physical distancing without promoting isolation. And how really can we retrofit our current public spaces to serve the needs right now and the future needs of our public?
Well, oops. Am I in? Yeah, all I can say is that we're living it now. So it's so hard to kind of see what, you know, how we're going to propose ways that can include a concern for contagion, right? I think that's kind of what you're asking over the long term. I think we're developing now sort of different approaches to stay sort of physically distanced while still going back to places of work where people are congregated, or public spaces where people can still, you know, go and have a picnic or walk around. And we're going towards a direction of lower densities, you know, right now. It's such a great question, you know, sort of what will be the impact of taking that as a concern long term, right? Because we're living this pandemic now, but we will come out of it thinking this is a possible concern for the future for another, you know, potential contagious situation, right?
Right, and I think ultimately it becomes very much a political issue and a, you know, government relations strategy. I think, you know, our leaders are going to have to decide, you know, what kinds of tax incentives and other subsidies they want to, you know, offer to create these spaces in anticipation of continued challenge beyond COVID-19. You know, what's next? We just don't, obviously, we don't know. You know, epidemiologists and you know, others involved in healthcare, you know, would anticipate that we will face, you know, other issues, not necessarily as dramatic as what we're experiencing now with COVID-19. But remember, I mean, we had SARS, we had, you know, we had Ebola. There will be other major challenges globally. Part of the reason in the United States we've, you know, been impacted, you know, to the degree we have is because our federal government failed us. That's just David Stortow's opinion. I'm sorry if there are people, you know, on this who, you know, feel otherwise. You're entitled to your opinion, but fundamentally, you know, health, it's going to be very much our next challenge is going to depend upon, you know, what our leadership, you know, does or doesn't do to, you know, promote public health in the ways that some other countries have that have, you know, come out of this much better than we have.
Yeah, two additional comments to that. Just one is public health is 2.5% of a $3.5 trillion healthcare budget, right? So that in and of itself is something to think about. B, when we think about politics, we have to also recognize that it was a very unique moment in terms of bipartisan work that got the Great American Outdoors Act passed, right? So that was essentially to permanently fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So how is that money then distributed? What is required in terms of the way we approach that funding to ensure that that is actually being equitably distributed, right? So there are opportunities if we can think in a creative way and an equitable way to ensure that the nature is then connected to the public health infrastructure and the public health resiliency of our country.
I would add that we should also be thinking a little bit more to our future with resiliency and sustainability, because I think they're very closely interwoven with pandemics and public health. And I know, you know, that's something that as landscape architects, that feels certainly more familiar to me, to be thinking about sustainability and resiliency more than pandemic health. So some of the strategies that we're implementing is, you know, really designing for climate change and thinking through how will our landscapes adapt in, you know, 5, 10, 20 years, and thinking through, you know, the 100-year storms are happening really every other year now. And I saw there's a question in my queue about the production studio project and how we're kind of designing for sea level rise, and we are designing for the entire project to be flooded. The whole project we anticipate, we know will happen. We're doing extensive research on flood barrier design, deployable systems, working with marine engineers, because it's really not a question of if, it's when. And so we need to kind of understand, you know, our plant palette. New York City, since I lived there, went from being zone, I think, 6 to 7B. We're now subtropical. That's a wild change. And that, you know, certain strategies, I love the Green Roof initiative. I'm a GRP. I love that we just passed, I think it was last fall, the local law that we're having photovoltaic and mandatory green roofs for new construction. I think we need to, again, on a policy level, get a little bit more aggressive with mandating green roofs or green infrastructure strategies, doing bioswales as the norm. I think tying it into the current pandemic, where we're starting to take over the parking spaces and decentralize the car, presents a good opportunity for streetscape plantings, for safety, because, you know, we now have people in our streets more often. We're spilling out and taking ownership over sidewalks. Well, we really then should incorporate a bioswale as a divider between the traffic and the pedestrian and the diner. So there's, I think, some really good opportunities to sort of dovetail these two together. Of this pandemic threw us into unexpected conditions, and how are we coping, and then bringing in some really resilient and sustainable strategies that look to the future.
Yeah, I'd like to add, I mean, we all just in terms of like a hopeful way that change is feasible and possible. We all changed the majority of our behavior within the time span of weeks, if not within a month of March. It was when it's needed, when it's, so there is potential for behavior change very, very quickly. And I think we should take that as a sign of hope and possibility.
Yeah, and I think coupled with, you know, looking at our environment, our public spaces, even our private spaces, holistically, looking at all the different aspects of what makes it a well site for people, for the environment, to adapt to climate change, to hopefully turn climate change around. You know, having guidelines like, you know, similar to like LEED guidelines for architecture, Sustainable Sites Initiative guidelines, making those a priority and mandatory, really, is what it's going to take for us to be able to adapt to all of this change. We've got to push forward. We've got to, you know, speak up. We've got to, you know, make this good design and holistic design the priority. I guess that's my that's my rant. and advocate for it, both locally and on the federal level. We continue to get the right people with the powerful voices to make decisions for the future of our public spaces. It's a necessity at this point. There's a couple of other questions that I want to jump to. Wow, should there be local, statewide, or even federal requirements for implementing design strategy to elevate well-being and promote positive mental health? And I want to jump to a little bit of a discussion on mental health and also in relationship to this current pandemic. Do any of you feel that there's going to be a greater need for therapeutic and healthcare facilities as a result of this pandemic? And if so, what could be done on a local, statewide, or federal level that could make implementing these designs a priority?
I'm working on a couple of psychiatric facilities right now, and I think our greatest challenge happens to be funding. So that would certainly help. The mental health is a great spectrum. A psychiatric facility is a very different level than counseling for, so I think we need to consider that funding will be necessary, and creating facilities that incorporate nature in them would be quite wonderful. But yeah, I absolutely think mental health will go up.
It's a huge need, and part of the reason that, even pre-COVID, the need for psychiatrists, other mental health professionals, particularly for children, has been, one of the most significant gaps in our healthcare system. And part of it is because incentives have been aligned for, decades in ways that have not, incented, people to go into the profession. And, that's changing. When you see comparisons of salaries and income levels of different specialists, some of the biggest jumps you're seeing in the past couple of years, percentage-wise. So when you're starting from a lower number to begin with, understand you're still starting with a lower number, but have been, with psychiatrists. And, primary care physicians is the other area that where we've been in need of more providers. And, healthcare, Medicare, commercial insurance systems have rewarded surgery and proceduralists. And so that's where the big dollars are in orthopedic surgery and neurosurgery. And that's where the finer facilities are that, are able to, support, the kinds of environments that we wish were available for patients suffering from psychiatric disorders, or, my case in particular, rehabilitation. Part of the reason we built the facility in the way that we did here, I happen to just have a very strong desire to make a statement, a bold statement, that rehabilitation medicine is as important an area of specialization in medicine as heart hospitals and in orthopedic hospitals. And fortunately, I was able to get my stakeholders across our whole healthcare system on board with that idea, and people in our philanthropic community to pony up to help with it. And I think the same thing needs to happen more with these areas that have been in need and underserved. And until we both, change the reimbursement methodologies in healthcare, as well as get philanthropists behind areas like mental health. Let's face it. I mean, some of the lousiest facilities in healthcare are psychiatric facilities and rehab. I mean, you go into typical, hospital, general hospital, and look for the psych ward or the rehab unit. It's going to, more likely be in the basement next to the morgue. It's just not been, appreciated historically, and hopefully, given the massive need we have now, and maybe COVID, one of the silver linings of it, just even putting more of a spotlight on the mental health implications will result in more dollars flowing into this area.
Yeah, I think just
No,
go ahead, Nélida.
No, but I was just going to mention that we know already the numbers are going up of people reaching out to for therapeutic services, for instance, and I think we will see definitely that there will be an impact. But what I think, as David mentioned, that also just has perhaps the one benefit that we're paying more attention to these issues. I think stigma about mental illness is a concern, and for people actually reaching out when it's needed, possibly when treatment might be more, sort of particularly effective, and instead of sort of trying to deny it or not address it because of this concern for stigma. But I think the fact that, that just isolation, I mean, we can see how much isolation can impact our well-being, even if you start out, you were fine before, and suddenly you start feeling, sort of this kinds of impacts on your well-being. Yeah, I think it's bringing attention to the fact that this can become a major concern for a broader spectrum of the population.
Yeah, I think a couple of trends, Jennifer, that just building off on this, I think there are a couple of trends that we need to sort of keep in mind. Veterans coming back from the various wars who are experiencing PTSD, who've experienced sort of traumatic brain injury, et cetera, are leveraging nature-based solutions. So getting veterans out into nature as a form of therapy, form of therapeutics, right? So that in and of itself brought a lot of attention to mental health, in particular, suicide prevention. Second is the opioid crisis that we experienced in 2014, right? This is something that, again, brought mental health to the forefront, especially in rural areas. But, you continue to see the disproportionate effect and really saw that impact of social determinants of health broadly, right? And third is that pandemic is thinking, as we think about it, both in terms of design and who has the support to be checked in on. So in 1995, for example, we had a significant heat wave in Chicago. And the people who were less connected socially were more likely to die, as well as, of course, folks who didn't have air conditioners, right? Because nobody was checking in on them. And so how we think about sort of mental health infrastructure, as someone who used to work on preventing substance-exposed pregnancies, David's point's correct, right? Like that the actual infrastructure is very, very lacking when it comes to substance use treatment. And it is some of the least funded spaces, right? So what are the design influences there? Especially for, as a maternal and child health person, especially thinking early stages, right? Second is, how do we then think about it at the broader scale when you're hitting a larger proportion of the population? A Deborah Cohen study found that, green space, the closer you live, the better off you are in terms of mental health and depression, but that wasn't equitably distributed for Black and Brown communities, right? So how do we think about that and ensure that inclusiveness is part of that conversation? And then the third is, in all of this, getting rid of that stigma that everybody experiences poor and negative mental health, good and negative mental health outcomes, and that everybody has mental health, and it's not just sort of this negative thing that we need to be worried about.
Yeah, I like, you know, you brought up some really good points about different things, you know, bringing more attention to mental health. And I also would like to think that because we are, and this is going full circle a little, you know, we are more connected with technology. We are connected with media. There's, you know, there's a Twitter feed for everything. It's also the bright side to that. While the negative side might be that, you know, maybe we're spending too much time with technology. The bright side is that there's a lot more media exposure to mental health issues. I've seen things on the morning programs where some of the co-anchors talked about their own personal experience. They've never talked about it before in public, but you know, through media, they're able to reach a lot of people, and the effect of that, you know, even somebody watching the video on Instagram might be able to pick up on that and say, oh, I'm feeling the same thing. I think that is hopeful, and also something to that this current pandemic needs to focus on is that we need to continue to keep it open and have conversations and connect socially, you know, even when we can't be physically, you know, together like we are today. You know, we're connecting, and it actually led to a question that I had, wasn't going to go to, but do you feel that our actually, I'm going to skip that because I think we answered it.
Can I say something?
Sure.
What you were saying just made me think of something, you know, like very early in the pandemic, the first thing people were saying was social distancing, right? And to me, it was like, oh, what a bad term, right? Because you don't want to socially distance, you want to physically distance. And that doesn't mean that you're not connecting in this way, you know, or through other media or in other ways, right? Right.
Definitely. I think social is, you know, it's one of those main components of health and well-being, is social connections. I have 2 questions that are related to climate, and I have 2 questions that are related to abilities. And I think what I'm going to do is jump just so we can accommodate these questions because they're really great. There's a question here from Michael, who says, I like David's comment whereby architects actually used wheelchairs for a period so that they can obtain a live experience of a wheelchair user. Lately, I've seen projects where a site designer feels that just as long as he meets the code of under 5% pitch, that the access way can be unlimited in length. So really he's asking, how do we get site designers to design with greater sensitivity to disabled? Do you have any thoughts?
I can start on that one. You know, it's both, you know, site designers, but also obviously owners, you know, who, you know, can, you know, have the biggest impact here. And I think the thing that is important is, you know, very frequently, you know, this is kind of viewed as, you know, a costly accommodation. And oftentimes it's not. I mean, you know, certain accommodations can be more costly, but it's also just a philosophy of how you design and build that doesn't necessarily always cost a lot more money. And one of the things that, you know, we talk about a lot within the community of people with disabilities, or more recently characterized as adaptively able-bodied people, is there's a business case. I mean, restaurant owners that have environments that are friendly toward wheelchair users are going to get good business from wheelchair users. And there are a lot of very, very affluent, successful people who are adaptively able-bodied, who are very sophisticated in their selection of where they choose to give their business, whether it's a restaurant, whether it's, you know, to hotels, to whatever the case may be. And so I think that it's not just altruistic on the part of an owner. And so site designers who are working with owners around whatever the kind of environment that's being created can help to have people understand that there's a business case to be made here. It's not all altruism, it's good business.
I would follow that up with designing for people with disabilities. As I kind of mentioned in my speech, we may all experience a type of disability at some point in our lives. It's highly likely. And whether it's a temporary, long-term, or life-spanning disability, we will all experience it. We certainly will all experience aging. And so I think to encourage designers to be thoughtful to design for the human condition seems like a baseline, and a little bit why I'm not so much an advocate for design to code compliance is because I think it's the most unimaginative, lowest common denominator. And I think great designers, which we all aspire to be, are ones that take it beyond the requirement. And so how do we encourage people to do that? You know, we create inspiring spaces that then inspire other designers. That's how I would approach it. And the code is just the baseline, and we're thoughtful for the human condition across our span.
Okay. Let me go to the next question. The next question that's related, it says, when thinking about just landscapes, what does the open street project and parking space removal for parklets mean to people with physical mobility challenges or transportation challenges? What should we keep in mind to ensure equitable access? It's a really good question. Go ahead, Brett.
It's particularly tricky in tight spaces. So I think that's where I'm noticing it to be challenges, that maneuverability. So I think we have to create certainly seating areas that can accommodate a chair user to be able to navigate to the space, people that would like a railing or a slight curb ramp, because we're adapting existing spaces. You know, so often we have the curb cut at the corner, and maybe the parklet is at the mid-block range. So I think when we're creating that space, we have to understand that transition, that there's wide enough aisles for transition between streetscape and parklet. And it is tricky when there's tight space. You know, these restaurants weren't designed to fill up 2 parking spaces, and now they are. In terms of transportation, it is also particularly challenging because many mobility impaired persons rely on buses more than subways. And so, you know, the bus is a street component. So I don't own a dog, so I don't know where it's coming from, but I hear it. But I love him. So we want to kind of, we have to be smart and adaptable. It's a challenge, but I think we have to do it.
I'm sorry, I've been trying to avoid it. My dog is going crazy in the background.
They want to go out for a walk, I'm sure.
Probably. Or
they want outside. Dogs need outdoor space too.
It could be the sort of the delivery, some delivery or something that drives them nuts. But sorry about that.
No problem.
But I think the question was related to making public spaces equitable or accessible for everyone. Is that the direction we're going. So I was just, what I would want to add to that, yes, it's an issue of budget, I think as Britt mentioned, but also David had mentioned something that sometimes we think it's more expensive just because we assume it's more expensive, and maybe sometimes you want to, if as a designer, if you have the opportunity of maybe making that sort of bringing the comparison to the client and saying to what extent is more expensive, and is there a benefit to it in the sense of the accessible restaurants. I'm part of the executive committee for the NGO Committee on Aging of the United Nations. And we do have, when we could go to the United Nations, we had events there, and often wanted to have like an event afterwards for people to get together. And one of the things is finding restaurants that are accessible, right? Because of our community of there are people with who will need a certain accessible ramp or something, and the business of the group always goes to the restaurant that does have it, and it's usually there are very, very few, at least within the area near the United Nations. So if one can make that argument and sort of show that it's not always about the budget, and then maybe sometimes even something that looks like it's more expensive, until you do the calculations and you see the maybe long-term benefit of those design decisions, that maybe they're actually more, work in favor of your budget.
I've also seen the parklets that can be put right next to the curb, but they're elevated with adjustable base so that they can be made at the same height of the curb, so that it's easy to kind of roll or walk onto to that platform for the outdoor dining facilities. Sorry. Go ahead.
And as I said, yes, you're bringing the wheelchair business, right? Maybe, but you're also bringing a lot of other business. You might be bringing the mom with a stroller again, or, some other constituency that will be happy to go to a place that makes it easier for them to access the space, right? Mm-hmm. And in terms of usage of public spaces, if you're also serving other groups that beyond, a person on a wheelchair when you have that type of accessibility ramp.
Right. We're getting close to wrapping up on questions. I do want to grab a couple of specific questions before we go. Sadiya, you talked about an elevation of heat stress as it relates to creating more just spaces. Is TPL undertaking a similar approach to evaluate quality exposure and design strategies for improving air quality in landscapes that are near roads and industrial areas, which are disproportionately occupied by low-income and minority communities? This seems to be a reality that urban parks are located near point sources of air pollution.
Sure. I don't know if I'm fully capturing the question here in terms of response. I can just sort of go quickly over an overview. So there is a concept called the urban heat island effect, which I'm sure most folks are familiar with, that certain pockets of green space, cities are hotter than others, and that parks can serve as a nature-based solution for that. And that effect actually extends about a half mile outside of a park based on research that was done in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. So what we do at the Trust for Public Land, our research and innovation department actually creates GIS mapping tools that have overlays of, whether it's, let's say, if you're interested in obesity and physical activity, that could be one sort of metric that you can look at a city level. Or we also actually just incorporated this year into Park Serve our heat mapping efforts. And so that can be leveraged as well. In addition to that, we have our climate director and climate team lead a program called climate smart cities. That's a bit more of sort of a powerhouse in terms of bringing data and evidence base to inform that effort.
Great. Thank you. I have a question for Britt. In the production studios project, how did you incorporate end of century sea level rise projections in the wetland areas? Are there strategies you looked at in a temporal sense of how health and wellness benefits might change as the landscape adapts?
Yeah, so some of the benefits that we studied for climate change and resiliency, I had mentioned a little bit earlier, but we designed the hardscape as a boardwalk system on a helical pile pier system, as opposed to what we more often see in parks on a subgrade base. So by creating an elevated walk, I think that was really an important gesture to try and capture all the stormwater. The walkways are ADA compliant metal grating and decking. So again, we'll have flow through. All the plantings are salt tolerant and floodable, and they're graded in a way that I'd say the majority of the landscape is a bioswale. There is an upland tidal area and forest area. So it was really thinking long-term sustainability, and then tying in the resiliency strategy for protecting the first floor of the building. So the building is designed to be flooded completely on the first floor. So we have a deployable system that will connect to the building and then tie into our boardwalk detail. In terms of health and wellness for long-term, we're also doing the green roofs and the terraces, so combating a lot of that urban heat island and stormwater management, and also giving people spaces that when they're trapped inside all day, they can get outside to a closely adjacent terrace, and maybe they can't go all the way down. And then we created a couple of seating options that are at raised elevation to kind of play on, which I think is going to be great for the benthetic and epifaunal animals that we were discussing earlier in my presentation. So that's a lot of the resiliency strategies for long term that we're thinking about. In terms of health and wellness on a community level, I think by sort of taking back this industrial shoreline and giving it as a park to the people is an important step towards healing the community and creating green space in a zoned industrial area where people do live adjacent to this, and they can now use this as a park. As we were saying, some of these populations really don't have enough access to green space, and that's not acceptable. So kind of playing with some of those zoning laws to get waterfront public access.
Thank you. So we're nearing the end of our Q&A part of the program. If any of you have any questions for each other, we could continue this discussion during the happy hour, which will be a little more informal and also not recorded. So maybe a little more open discussions. So I'm going to go ahead and close off the Q&A and give it back to Naomi to take us home. Thank you very much to all the panelists.
Everyone. I realized I didn't introduce myself at the beginning of the event, but my name is Naomi Drucker, and I'm a volunteer for ASLA New York and an associate at RKLA Studio Landscape Architecture. I would just personally like to thank all of the speakers for their wonderful insight today and their presentations. I would also like to thank everyone at ASLA New York who helped organize this event. Oh, I realized, hold on, I wanted to share my screen, sorry. Now we're better. So if everyone would take a look at ASLA-NY.org for our upcoming events. We have the third installation of our webinar series, Let's Talk Plans, on Monday, this coming Monday, October 26th from 5 to 6. I also wanted to say thank you to our sponsors, to Deeproot and Inova. As a reminder, Inova is also sponsoring the LARE grant competition for those looking to achieve licensure. So if you want to take a look into that. And then the big thing is that there is a link in the chat to the quiz and the evaluation. So if you're looking for credits from this event, to go there. As a reminder, in order to get your CEUs, you have to get 80% or higher on the quiz. And then I have just some additional resources up here, which I think Jennifer put in the chat already, but there's a link to in your email inboxes to our Zoom happy hour. And I know it's not going to be the same as an in-person event where I would love to see you all in person, but I'll be heading over there and I hope you'll grab a drink and come join us. We're going to head over there now. If you want to grab a drink and come in 5-10 minutes, we'll be there and we'd be happy to have you. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.